The next item of business is an emergency question from Neil Findlay on the IT problems at NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. Mr Findlay.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the IT problem at NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Cabinet Secretary Alec Neil.
Officer, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde have informed us that as a result of a failure in their IT infrastructure yesterday morning, a number of outpatient appointments, inpatient procedures, day surgery cases and chemotherapy appointments have had to be postponed. Despite NHS staff working overnight to resolve this issue, it has continued into today. Let me stress right away, Presiding Officer, that maternity and emergency services have been maintained throughout. I understand that the failure is related to network servers that serve a number of the board's systems and sites. This meant that clinicians were unable to access some services, including some patient records and imaging. In addition, the recognised standby process did not kick in. There has been minimal impact to today's cases and inpatient procedures. Only those procedures that require live access to images in theatres have been affected today. In respect of outpatient appointments, there has been an impact where the consultant is seeing a patient for the first time or requires access to electronic patient records. However, early indications are that up to now less than 10% of outpatient appointments have been affected by this incident, and there has been minimal impact on day cases and inpatient appointments. I would, however, express my concern for all those patients whose treatment was affected yesterday and today. I have this morning spoken to the Chair of the Board, and the Director-General for Health and Social Care in the Scottish Government has spoken to the Board's Chief Executive. I can report that NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde have now been able to resolve the problem with the server and are incrementally reloading users back onto the system, and it would appear that no data appears to have been lost. Around 50% of users now have access to the system, and the remainder should have access by later this evening. However, the system is being closely monitored to ensure it remains robust. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde are contacting all patients who have been affected by this incident to ensure they receive their treatment as soon as possible and that appointments are rescheduled as quickly as possible. I've asked that the Board keeps in close contact with my officials to ensure that we're fully appraised of the situation going forward. In addition, my officials will work closely with the Board to establish the root cause of this incident and to share the lessons with other NHS boards. Finally, Presiding Officer, I would like to thank all staff in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde for their efforts over the last 2 days in working to resolve this issue.
Neil Findlay.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. The situation is obviously very worrying, and many people have had their appointments cancelled. Will the Cabinet Secretary advise what will happen to those patients who have missed appointments and can't get immediate appointments once more? What reassurance can he give to patients waiting on treatment over the next few days? And also, it's my understanding that similar systems are being used in other health board areas. Will the Cabinet Secretary instruct an independent review of all IT systems being used to ensure that robust contingency plans are in place across Scotland?
Cabinet
Officer,
Secretary.
on the last point, I've already instructed a robust review right across the National Health Service in Scotland with all the NHS boards to make sure that these systems are robust and that the backup system is robust as well. In terms of the people affected by this, let me give you, before I come into the chamber, I updated the figures, as you would expect. Over the last 2 days, up until midday today, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde have postponed the following: 500 outpatient appointments, 14 planned inpatient procedures, 43 day cases, 48 chemotherapy patient treatments, but in the same period, 7,400 patients have had their procedures and appointments maintained. On the first point raised by Mr Findlay, every effort will be made to ensure that those affected by this problem will be treated at the earliest possible opportunity, and this will be a matter of urgency to ensure that all those affected by this crashing of the IT system will, in fact, receive their appointments as soon as possible in the near future.
I've had many requests for supplementaries. I'll do my very best to get through them. Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In your opening remarks, Cabinet Secretary, you said that emergency services had not been affected. Can you further confirm this? And do you anticipate any problems at all in the next couple of days in regards to particular emergency services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I can absolutely guarantee you that no one requiring emergency or maternity services have been affected, nor is there any anticipation whatsoever that, even if the problem is not resolved this evening, that would need to happen. The essential impact of this IT failure has been to deny access to certain aspects of the IT systems, and I can give you a list of the IT systems affected if you so desire that level of detail. And it really is, the impact has been made on planned appointments and planned procedures. There is no impact on emergency services or in maternity services, I am delighted to say.
Jackson Carlow.
Does the Cabinet Secretary agree this was not a failure of policy or management, but the failure of a system? And will he accept the support of everybody on this side of the chamber for the work that has been done in order to resolve it as speedily as it turns out it has been? He made reference to lessons being learned and potentially passed on to other health boards. In resolving of the issue, has the Health Board isolated now what the problem was, and do they have any reason to believe that it may be something that other health boards need to know about urgently in case such an incident were to occur elsewhere, or is it of a more unexpected nature?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, first of all, can I thank Mr Carlow for the tone of his remarks, which are much appreciated and I'm sure will be very much appreciated by the staff working so hard to resolve this issue. It's too early yet to be absolutely sure as to why this has happened and why the backup system wasn't more resilient. We have the two software server companies, Microsoft and Charteris, involved full-time with our staff as well as the Greater Glasgow and Clyde staff to try to get to the root cause of the problem. Although we've now, it looks as though, and I'm cautious about this obviously, but it looks as though we've broken the back of the problem in terms of the system being back up and rebooted successfully. We'll know definitely how robust that is by later this evening, but absolutely the top priority is to get to the root of the problem so that we can be absolutely sure that it doesn't happen again either in Glasgow or in any other part of the National Health Service in Scotland.
Drew Scott. Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome what the Cabinet Secretary says in his commitment that he would want anyone who has missed an appointment to be seen as quickly as possible. Could he give an indication, though, of whether that would be on the basis of one offer or as many offers as it takes? I mean, clearly there is a need for people to plan and rearrange their lives, sometimes to attend a hospital appointment. So in the event that someone is offered a new appointment quickly, as he suggests, and is unable to take it up, will they be able to continue to liaise with the Health Board to get that appointment as soon as possible, rather than then being put at the back of a queue?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, under the circumstances, every effort will be made to accommodate patients who have been affected by this impact on the IT system, and we will be totally flexible in trying to ensure that people get their appointments as quickly as possible. Inevitably, I think it will involve working longer hours, perhaps for a short period of time, extending the hours of appointments in order to make sure that everybody who is affected by this actually is treated within a reasonable period of time. I have had the total assurance of the Chair of the Board that absolutely every stop will be pulled out to make sure that these patients get their postponed treatment or appointment at the earliest possible opportunity, hopefully in every case well before a month's over, let alone a week or days.
Jim Hume.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I too recognise that the Government has acted very speedily on that, so it's not a matter of criticising any policy here whatsoever. But could the Cabinet Secretary explain how many of these patients he anticipates will now fail to be treated within their respective treatment time guarantee periods? And could he confirm that all those affected who are awaiting chemotherapy will receive their scheduled treatment who have obviously missed their appointment now, will receive their scheduled treatment by the end of the week?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, first of all, on chemotherapy, I should say the chemotherapy services are working fairly normally today. Yesterday's chemotherapy appointments were affected, however. And can I also thank the member for the tone of his remarks as well. Can I say, until the IT system is up and running, I can't give him any statistics in terms of the numbers that this will affect in terms of the treatment time guarantee. Once I'm in a position to do that, I would be more than happy to supply members with that information. And I'm sure when the formal statistics come out over this period on TTG, that members will be understanding in terms of any breaches in terms of the TTG in relation to Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Bob Doris.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, whilst I welcome the IT review across all health boards that you mentioned, of course no IT system will ever be foolproof. Can I therefore ask you whether you believe health boards have contingencies in place now when computer systems stop working to make sure that patient care for the most vulnerable, including cancer patients, are not compromised when the computers stop working?
Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, absolutely. There are two contingencies. One is the contingency in relation to a backup IT system. And as I said earlier, the backup system for some reason did not work in this case, which is obviously particularly worrying and one of the reasons why we're giving so much emphasis on getting to the root of the problem being the original malfunction, but also why did the backup system not work when it should have done. And that's obviously what we're testing elsewhere. There are also other backup systems in terms of, for example, with chemotherapy to ensure that patients are treated the way they would normally be treated, and where necessary, paper exercises have been undertaken to minimise any impact, particularly on chemotherapy and patients requiring very serious treatment.
Duncan McNeill.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer so far and covered in a lot of detail. I think I would ask the Cabinet Secretary, not to underestimate the scale of this issue, and I'm sure he doesn't. Glasgow Clyde NHS book 20,000 appointments a week. So there's a whole range of number of those who have missed an appointment, and there's another scale of numbers who haven't. And never to waste a crisis, can lessons be learned? I'm sure he's had representation from staff about the introduction of track care and their concerns about the introduction. The redeployment of secretarial staff and the scaling down of secretarial staff has had an impact, and of course the promised hardware on the ground, some issues and problems there. I'm sure he'll take these issues on board while we investigate the full scale of this and ensure that resources are put in place to take up the issues that have arisen for many people in my constituents and of course that Glasgow Clyde area board.
Presiding Officer, the member makes a number of reasonable points, and I should point out 10 hospitals across the Greater Glasgow and Clyde area have been affected by this, but some of the patients, of course, come from further afield, such as Ayrshire and parts of Lanarkshire, particularly for the chemotherapy services, as an example. Can I emphasise, however, to the member that the problem is not with any particular software, it's with the server. And although track care has been adversely affected, it's not as a result of any problem with track care, it's a result with the server. So that the Chamber is fully informed, the systems which have been affected adversely by this are track care, as I say, not because of a problem with track care, problem with the server, Portal, Ascribe, PACS plus other diagnostic systems, laboratory systems, chemotherapy systems and the contact centre.
Finally, John Scott.
Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary is well aware that NHS Ayrshire and Arran depends on NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde for the provision of services, as do many other adjoining health boards. Can he tell Parliament what effect this loss of IT capacity has had specifically on service provision in NHS Ayrshire and Arran, please?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, once the IT systems are up and running again, I will then ask for an analysis of the health board, the home area, for the patients affected by this, if we can do that analysis so that we can find out how many patients from Ayrshire and Arran, from Lanarkshire and from other health boards have been affected by this. Obviously, because of the problem itself, I'm not in a position to give reliable statistics at the moment, but I am more than happy to supply members with that analysis when it becomes available on a reliable basis.
Thank you very much. We move to, my apologies to the two members who didn't get called. I need to protect the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 7872 in the name of Jackie Bailey on the cost of living. Members who wish to take part in this debate should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Jackie Bailey to speak to and move the motion. Ms Bailey, you've got 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. There can be no doubt in anybody's mind that times are tough, but they are much tougher for some than they are for others. I'm not often given to quoting David Cameron, but this, however, isn't the first time I've done it. I'm sure it won't be the last time I've done it, because I do want to remind everyone what he said at a previous Tory conference. It's fair that those with the broadest shoulders should bear a greater load. He was, of course, talking about this in the context of the recession and the UK plan for recovery. What a shame it is that he didn't really believe his own rhetoric. It took him less than a month to forget his promise and embark on swinging public sector cuts of £81 billion, including £18 billion of cuts to benefits. All of this whilst the most affluent avoid paying taxes to the tune of £120 billion. So the reality of the Tory Lib Dem coalition government is tax cuts for millionaires, at least 8 of which sit around the cabinet table, tax cuts for hedge funds, and the ultimate scandal, Tory ministers scurrying to Brussels to protect bankers' bonuses. The last time I looked, no, we've heard enough from you. The last time I looked, these were the people who had the broadest shoulders.
Miss Bailey, a simple no thank you would suffice.
Oh, thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The last time I looked, these were the people who had the broadest shoulders. But don't kid yourself that they're feeling the pinch or bearing a greater load. Instead, families in my constituencies, indeed families across Scotland, are struggling to make ends meet. They are the ones bearing the burden. Whilst David Cameron is increasingly out of touch, they are the people who are out of pocket. Those that are paid weekly, not having enough money to make it last through the last couple of days. Those that are paid monthly, struggling to have enough money to make it through the final week. And these aren't just people and families who are unemployed and on benefits. These are working families too. And it is many of these people who work hard but are low paid that are appearing at food banks in order to feed their children, seeking out payday lenders who they cannot then afford to pay back, or running up rent arrears and defaulting on mortgages as they make decisions about the priorities for their families. And the reason the problem is so acute is that the cost of living is rising at the same time as income is declining in real terms, and people cannot afford to make ends meet. And let me illustrate that with the shift in incomes first. Since 2010, wages in Scotland have fallen in real terms by £27.30 a week. That's £1,420 a year. That's a lot of money if you are low paid. In fact, in 36 out of the 37 months that David Cameron has been Prime Minister, wages have fallen. The Low Pay Commission has also noted that the minimum wage has not kept up with inflation, and the real value was lower than the increase in both the Consumer Price Index and the Retail Price Index. Indeed, they suggested that the value of the national minimum wage at October 2012 was at a level not seen since 2004, some 8 years ago.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Jackie Bailey, for giving way. Would Jackie Bailey not agree with me if the national minimum wage, when it was first introduced, had been introduced at the rate that the trade unions were asking for at the time of £5 an hour, we wouldn't be in this situation at the present moment with the minimum wage falling far behind that of the Scottish living wage?
Jackie Can Bailey. I say that that's very interesting from John Wilson, aside from the fact that we ensured it was uprated adequately. I do recall that the SNP slept through the debate and the vote to bring in the national minimum wage, so I'll not take any lessons from him now. But what we've seen the Tories do is squeeze the minimum wage, reduce its value in real terms, and in contrast, Labour would strengthen the minimum wage and end the scandal of the abuse of zero-hour contracts. But we've also seen real terms reductions in public sector pay, now in its 4th year, taking a real toll on staff and their families. There's no doubt that there's a real squeeze on incomes amongst those who are low paid, never mind the cuts made to benefits, which I will come on to shortly. And whilst this is bad enough and people are struggling to make ends meet, they face a double whammy because prices are rising at the same time as their incomes are stagnant. Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report, A Minimum Income Standard for the UK in 2013, highlighted that cost of a basket of essential goods and services has increased by nearly 25% in the last 5 years. Now that's staggering. The cost of bread is up, the cost of milk is up, the cost of electricity and gas are up. Over the last 3 years, since the Tories came to office, prices have risen faster in the UK than in any other G7 country. We are facing a cost of living crisis of enormous proportions, with really harsh consequences for people and families on low incomes.
Mark MacDonald.
I appreciate what the member says, and I think she and I would be in agreement on a lot of things, but how does she square that circle with her desire and her party's desire for these same low-income families to pay more in council tax?
Jackie Bailey.
I mean, this is just ridiculous. If you actually examine the SNP's record, you are the ones that are taking money away from low-income families by actually not targeting their needs. And we've seen cuts in benefits, the bedroom tax, the shift from disability living allowance to personal independence payments, assuming a reduction of 20% in the budget at the outset. But perhaps the most concerning is a reduction in child benefits. A freeze on child benefit, tax credits soon to be rolled up as universal credit, but overall children's benefits falling in real terms when the cost of bringing up a child is increasing. A decade of progress in reducing child poverty and family deprivation is being steadily reversed. Donald Hirsch, who is a director of the Centre for Research and Social Policy at Loughborough University and who leads the work on the minimum income standard, had this to say: "This trend differs from anything seen in my lifetime, including in the 1980s when the poor were standing still and the rich progressed. Now, absolute living standards have declined over a sustained period, including for those who started out with the least, for the first time since the 1930s. It's the first time since that decade that basic safety net benefits have been cut in real terms. If you have to go back more than 80 years to experience anything as bad, it must surely be a wake-up call for all of us." Let me now turn to the Scottish Government. And I know the SNP's take on this will be to say that it's Westminster's fault and the only way out of this is to vote for independence. But, you know, that is lazy and sloppy thinking. It is not the fault of an institution.
Mr Dornan, order.
It's the fault of the Tories. If you disagree with what the Tories are doing, then there is a clear choice. You can vote Labour at the general election. But there are things that this SNP government can do if they choose to do so. Things that are well within the government and this Parliament's powers. But, you know, instead of focusing on what matters to hard-pressed families and communities, they have only one focus, one obsession, one thing that commands all their attention, and that's independence. The SNP are guilty of putting Scotland on pause and doing little to tackle the most acute cost of living crisis in over 80 years. You know, well, I haven't got time. You know, when I was campaigning for a Scottish Parliament, it was because I realised the potential of the Parliament to help people at times like this. Just as the late lamented Strathclyde region had a social policy that prioritised and targeted support for many of those struggling in our communities, so too could a Scottish Parliament take action. So I'm therefore disappointed and ashamed that little is being done. The SNP stand accused of being so cynical and so shameless that they would prey on people's misery to get them to vote yes in the referendum rather than taking action to help now. And let me look at some of the areas that the SNP could tackle. And I want to start with childcare. The most recent Scottish childcare report by Children in Scotland reported that nursery costs for a child under 2 are now over £100 a week. A lot of money if you're on a low income. Childcare costs for the over 5 see parents paying an average of £50 per week for an after-school club, and these costs are rising by more than the rate of inflation. Childcare in Scotland is the least affordable in the UK, aside from the southeast of England. Save the Children are also very clear. They believe that childcare has a key role in tackling early inequalities between children and reducing child poverty. Quality, affordable childcare is key to helping parents to access and sustain employment and training. And they had this to say about the Children and Young People Bill, which seeks to extend childcare. And they said, and I quote, "They represent baby steps compared to what needs to change to ensure that every child and family can access suitable childcare." Last week, Ed Miliband pledged that childcare would be expanded to 25 hours a week for every 3- and 4-year-old of working parents. Childcare would also be guaranteed for all primary school children from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. That's what Labour would also deliver in Scotland. Will the SNP match this, or are they content to leave Scotland on pause? I genuinely don't have enough time. And what about food banks? The Trussell Trust reported in April this year that the number of people in Scotland using food banks has risen by 150%. to a staggering 14,318. 1/3 of these were children. 1/5 are in full-time employment. The latest research from Debt Advisory Scotland shows that 1 in 10 Scots, that's 500,000 Scots, borrowed money to pay for food in July. If you need any more evidence of a cost of living crisis, there it is. Whilst we are all grateful for the work of these volunteers in communities across Scotland, what a damning indictment it is on all of us that food banks can even exist. And it appears from the anecdotal evidence that some local authorities have sent people to food banks rather than providing a crisis grant. These crisis grants and community care grants, part of the Scottish Welfare Fund that is currently hugely underspent. Only half of what could have been allocated has gone out the door, and at a time when the need is self-evident. Now, what is astonishing here is that the direct transfer of power given to the SNP that they've wanted, they can't even manage to get the money spent. Another example of Scotland on pause when ministers aren't interested in getting their day job right. And let me move on to fuel poverty. The pledge made by Labour and agreed by the Parliament was that we would abolish fuel poverty by 2016. Yet when I ask ministers whether we're on track to do so, I don't even get an answer. So let me try again. Will the Scottish Government succeed in realising our collective ambition to end fuel poverty in 3 years' time? Well, the heads are down, Presiding Officer, no response. Using the Government's own measures, Energy Action Scotland estimate that fuel poverty stands at some 900,000 people. In the past 5 years, energy costs are 39% more and average household spend on fuel has reached a 14% high. Again, if you need any further idea of the scale of the cost of living crisis, then look no further. And what does the government do? There's a £79 million budget, but you rely on £120 million coming from energy company obligations to make it up. And it's underspent this year. Yet another example of the SNP not getting the money out the door to the people who need it the most. Last week, Ed Miliband proposed to tackle rising energy bills by pledging that the next Labour government will freeze gas and electricity prices until the start of 2017. This will provide real relief for hard-pressed families and older people, and it's time that the Tories stopped laughing and took action to protect people. But do the SNP support this? Now, I listened to SNP MP Mike Ware the other night, and he says that you don't. Are you really not prepared to stand shoulder to shoulder with families who are struggling? And please don't blame somebody else. Your own Fuel Poverty Forum have been telling you that you need to do more. Another case of Scotland on pause whilst you play constitutional politics. I can see, Presiding Officer, that I'm rapidly running out of time. Well, do you know what's depressing?
Order.
What's depressing is there are real issues affecting people in Scotland, and what you guys choose to do is play constitutional politics instead of thinking about that. Let me, Presiding Officer, conclude on the issue of child poverty. I've already said enough to this SNP government about the bedroom tax, and I hope they don't use the bedroom tax, a deliberate decision not to use the powers they have to protect people now. But let me finish on child poverty, because I'm very proud of the progress that the Parliament made. We saw the lowest drop in fuel poverty, both in relative and absolute fuel poverty, under the first years of the Parliament up to 2007. But sadly, under the SNP, progress has stalled.
I'm afraid you must finish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I conclude with the SNP do need to wake up. There is a real cost of living crisis going on for many families in communities across Scotland. These families need and deserve our help now. But what the SNP do is they put Scotland on pause. They are found guilty of the most shameless politics that puts the referendum first before the interests of the people of this country.
Thank you. I'm afraid members will have to keep to their time limits. This debate is oversubscribed. I now call on Angela Constance to speak to and move Amendment 7872.3 in the name of Alex Neil, Minister. Maximum 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome this debate. I think it's an important opportunity for this Parliament to continue to make its distinctive voice heard on such vitally important matters. And so let me begin by being clear. As a Scottish Government, we are absolutely determined to address the root causes of poverty. Scotland is a wealthy nation. We would be the 8th richest nation in the OECD by GDP per head. We are energy rich, our workforce is highly skilled, and our reputation for innovation is long established. We have world-class universities, and Scottish businesses are competing at the highest level worldwide. It's therefore a disgrace, a social, economic and moral disgrace, that in a nation such as ours, a resource-rich nation such as ours, that tens of thousands of children live in poverty. And it's also a disgrace that tens of thousands of older people live in poverty. And perhaps more than anything else, it is a disgrace that this has been true for generation after generation. So it's time, Presiding Officer, to change all that, and I believe Scotland has what it takes to make that change. And that is why, as a government, we have invested so much in supporting household incomes and tackling poverty. Others in this Parliament may call this something for nothing. We call it our social wage. It is our contract with the people of Scotland. And our amendment picks out just a few of the initiatives that this government and indeed previous administrations have taken. We have, I'm proud to say, frozen the council tax, saving the average Band D household in Fife more than £1,600 by 2016 and 17. The bus pass for, the bus pass for Scotland's older citizens will save cardholders around £250 a year. Bridge tolls have been scrapped, saving a regular commuter £233 a year, and nursery care is being expanded, saving families £707 per child per year. I'll take Mr Smith, I think it was.
Drew Smith, could you lift your microphone up? Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Very grateful to the Minister for coming back to me. On the point about council tax, I wonder if she can help me with this, because I thought the position of the Scottish National Party was that council tax was a regressive tax. How does freezing a regressive tax make it progressive?
Minister.
I actually believe in a Scotland where, unlike David Cameron, where those with the largest shoulders bear the biggest burden. But to do that, we need to have a social contract where everybody gets benefits. And that is what makes our society more cohesive, where we know that everybody gets something. And I understand why people may debate. I understand why people may debate about how many universal services we can afford in the grips of Westminster austerity. But what I object to most of all is the attack on the principle of universal benefits and the notion of a social contract. We are a cohesive society, and it's the social wage by the powers of independence that we want to protect and develop, and not knock down either by Labour regressive politics, regressive party politics, or indeed Westminster austerity. And let us not forget, Presiding Officer, we have free prescriptions which save the sick and infirm £104 per year. We've got free university tuition, saving students £9,000 a year, and free personal care for the elderly, introduced under the previous administration, funded and maintained by this administration. And this and other initiatives form our social wage, protecting incomes, delivering services, mitigating Westminster's misguided austerity. And we are doing this because we believe it is the right thing to do for the benefit of everyone in Scotland. It's also the fair thing to do. And we are doing this because international evidence shows that countries with greater equality perform better in economic terms. But we are doing this in the teeth of Westminster cuts. They will take hundreds of millions of pounds from households in low incomes. The cumulative reductions in Scotland will total an estimated £4.5 billion by 2015, of which around £1 billion will impact directly on children. We will not be able to mitigate the impact of all the changes, but we must continue to act when we can and where we can. So we have pledged £23 million to mitigate the cut in council tax benefit funding, and we have established the Scottish Welfare Fund in partnership with councils, and that's £33 million to deliver crisis grants and community care grants. And we are spending nearly £250 million over the spending review period on fuel poverty and energy efficiency. And as John Swinney has made clear, we are a government that will not walk by on the other side. Briefly, please.
Jackie Bailey. Thank you very much, and I will indeed be brief. Could I ask the Minister, does she support Ed Miliband's energy freeze?
Minister.
I think Ed Miliband's energy freeze is very well intended. I understand the desire in a resource-rich country like Scotland that it's a scandal that we have fuel poverty. What I would like to see Ed Miliband do, is publish the full analysis of the research underpinning the policy. And in terms of our view, we've got a very important energy commission looking at fuel poverty and pricing, as well as sustainability in the supply of energy, and an independent Scotland. I want to see the details. And I tell you, I would have been more confident about Ed Miliband if we actually looked at his record as Energy Minister in government, where profits for energy companies rocketed and the cost to household bills went up by over 33%. Presiding Officer, as a government, we have pledged to find £20 million to help those struggling the most with the costs of the bedroom tax. This help is absolutely vital. It has been widely welcomed, but it does not hide the harsh truth. Mitigation will not be enough. Mitigation cannot be enough. And this is the point that the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations made very forcefully this week. Their report, A Better State, Inclusive Principles for Scottish Welfare, made clear that what we need are the powers to deliver Scotland's own welfare and taxation systems. And I agree with Jackie Bailey when she criticises Westminster cuts. I share her concerns about the most vulnerable in our society. But what I cannot agree with is that when on 3rd of September she said, I am not saying that we cannot develop our own welfare system. I am saying that we should not develop our own welfare system. And it seems to me that Labour are willing to do no more than criticise Westminster cuts to welfare. And it seems to me that what Scotland needs is actually to cut Westminster out of welfare. And I'll take Ms Bailey on that point.
Jackie Bailey. Would the member not agree that it's actually quite progressive to share the risks and rewards across the country and redistribute some of the wealth that is indeed in the South East up to Scotland?
Minister.
Well, you know, it's a moot point, Ms Bailey, because sometimes when I speak to the most vulnerable people in my constituency, it feels as if we take all the risk and see very little of the reward. And let me read this quote. From Children's Society's Chief Executive, Matthew Reid, who earlier this year, in response to the UK Government's Welfare Reform Bill, said a nurse with 2 children would lose £424 a year by 2015, and an Army second lieutenant with 3 children £552 a year. He said many more will struggle to pay for food, heat their homes and provide other basics for their children as they find it increasingly difficult to keep up with rising prices. This is not the Scotland that we seek on these benches. We want a different Scotland, and we want the powers to achieve that vision of a more prosperous and fairer Scotland. Yet it is this party, the so-called Party of Equality, that wish to relinquish and abandon powers of welfare and taxation with their colleagues over here. And my final minute, Presiding Officer, we need very much the ability to ensure that the decisions affecting the day-to-day lives and living standards of people in Scotland, decisions around tax and welfare, that they are taken here in Scotland by the people of Scotland. And with those powers, with the powers of an independent nation, we can put an end to welfare cuts and abolish the bedroom tax. And we can protect household incomes and maintain the social wage. And we can build a system of taxation and welfare that is a progressive beacon. And we can end the generations of shame caused by child poverty, the generations of shame that have existed under the Union, both a Labour union and a Tory union. And what we need more than ever, Presiding Officer, is we need the full powers of an independent nation. And I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Gavin Brown to speak to and move Amendment 7872.4, a very tight 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me start with a quote from the BBC political correspondent Ben Wright from the 11th of August of this year. He said this: "With an economy that now seems to be gathering momentum, one of the key arguments that Labour have been making for the last 2 years, namely that the government got this wrong, their economic prescription failed, is no longer as powerful a message as it was 6 months or a year ago, which is why we are hearing a lot today about living standards." Now, we welcome this debate from the Conservative side of the chamber, but what I think was particularly disappointing about both Jackie Bailey's motion and indeed her speech is that it was high on rhetoric, but extremely light on solutions or ideas or suggestions of how we might tackle the problems that she has identified. What do they want the UK government to do? Something. What do they want the Scottish government to do? Something. So they want the Scottish government and the UK government to do something. They don't know what it is, but they want it to be done urgently. They've got no idea what it is they want to be done, but they want it done urgently, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, perhaps Ken McIntosh has the answer, in which case I'm happy to give way.
Ken McIntosh.
Mr. Brown, whether you could start by freezing the energy prices.
Gavin Brown.
The Labour policy which dare not speak its name until 12.5 minutes into the 14 minutes of Jackie Bailey's speech. But what I thought was interesting about that, was this. Jackie Bailey spent several minutes talking about how it is wrong, it's quite wrong not to target your resources. When she was in the Strathclyde region, she believed in targeting resources. When she was in the then Scottish Executive, they believed in targeting resources. It's quite wrong not to target your resources. However, let me finish this point. However, she then goes on to praises Ed Miliband's so-called energy policy, which, unless I missed a memo, Deputy Presiding Officer, doesn't target resources at all. It's a blanket freeze right across the board, and if Ian Gray can contradict that, I'm very happy to take his point.
Ian Gray.
Well, the point is absolutely clear. When it comes to using scarce public money, we believe it should be targeted. When it comes to targeting energy companies making outrageous profits, we believe we should target all of them.
Gavin Brown.
Deputy President, I'm just getting warmed up here. She also then praised a childcare policy that Ed Miliband pulled out the hat last week, which again wasn't targeted at all, but was universal. And Mark MacDonald, in an intervention, I think quite rightly, made the point that actually council tax freeze is extremely important, something we have enthusiastically backed this government on since 2008, and something that is specifically mentioned in the minimum income standard report from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation as being important. So I don't know what the current policy is from the Labour Party. First they were against the freeze, then they were for it. Now I don't know. I mean, I think perhaps they're in favour of it on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but against it on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, Deputy Presiding Officer. Perhaps you'll tell us what the official Labour Party policy is on the council tax freeze.
I would actually like to ask you a question. How can you stand there when you know now that there are 500,000 people who needed a loan to buy food in July? Does that not embarrass you?
Gavin Brown,
Presiding Officer, I don't think anybody on this side of the chamber is going to be complacent about the challenges that we face. But the challenges we face in this country are harder than in many other countries because the previous UK government built up a deficit and enormous debt in times of plenty, Deputy Presiding Officer. We don't blame everything on them, but they have to take at least a share of the responsibility. Now, I've given way several times already. I do want to make some progress, so not right now. The coalition government, Deputy Presiding Officer, has raised the income tax threshold, which will be £10,000 in April of next year. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, while saying it doesn't entirely offset increases to living costs, it does partially offset that. And it's made a difference to millions in Scotland and taken over 200,000 people out of income tax altogether.
Final minute.
The Joseph Rowntree Foundation talk about childcare costs being particularly difficult, having risen twice as fast as CPI inflation in the last 5 years. But in their conclusion say this: plans for more generous support of childcare costs from 2016 will, if implemented in their proposed form, greatly reduce the earnings required by families with children to reach the minimum income standard. Deputy Presiding Officer, this UK Government cancelled the rise in fuel duty that was projected. It's been frozen for 3.5 years, and we hear this week it's going to be frozen again up until the general election. This, of course, impacts on the cost of motoring, has a particular significance in rural areas, but affects public transport costs too, and the cost of goods more generally. We have the pensions triple lock, which has helped pensioners right across the country, and south of the border too we now have the council tax freeze, which will make a difference in the years going forward. Deputy Presiding Officer, this part of the UK Government is not complacent. There is a huge challenge to be faced, and it has taken a number of specific measures to tackle it, and I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I now call on Liam MacArthur to speak to and move amendment 7872.1. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Jackie Bailey's motion, if not her speech, legitimately illustrates the challenges to all of us as policymakers, but particularly those in office north and south of the border. I think it's perhaps worth recalling for Jackie Bailey's benefit that the gap between rich and poor went up under Labour, and the highest earners pay more and will pay more every year under this government than they did in any year under the previous Labour government. I will address the approach by the Scottish Government shortly, but my amendment, which I move, identifies important steps taken by the Coalition Government in response to these challenges. Gavin Brown's amendment highlights many of these same points, but in deleting the original motion, it perhaps risks glossing over the extent of the problems that we are currently witnessing. Gavin Brown does, of course, rightly identify the source of many of these problems, which was the economic crash unlike any since the 1930s. This brutal shock to our economic system, combined with unsustainable levels of debt that have been allowed to build up, required addressing. The consequences of not doing so, of ducking these hard choices, should not be underestimated or ignored, as both Jackie Bailey and Angela Constance seemed happy to do earlier. The alternative was to find ourselves facing many of the same painful problems endured by European partners such as Greece, Spain, Italy and even Ireland. But while the need for decisive action to rebalance our economy was, I believe, essential, I do welcome the steps that have been taken to mitigate some of the impacts. For low and medium tax rate payers, those in receipt of basic state pension and those struggling to meet childcare or fuel costs, all have benefited from additional support from the Coalition Government. Of course, the Liberal Democrat commitment during the last UK election campaign to raise the threshold at which people would begin to pay tax to £10,000 was not supported by everyone. I recall David Cameron insisting during the Leaders' debate that it was a laudable aspiration but unaffordable. And yet, by April 2014, the Liberal Democrats in government will see 224 lower-paid taxpayers in Scotland taken out of paying income tax altogether. Overall, 2.2 million taxpayers in Scotland will benefit from this significant progressive change to our tax system. I'll give way to Mark MacDonald.
Art MacDonald.
The member will also be aware that the Institute for Fiscal Studies did an analysis of UK government budget across the board, and it showed that the tax changes were in many cases cancelled out, and in some cases negatively so, by the benefit changes that are being pursued.
Liam MacArthur. Could we have Liam MacArthur's microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting point, a familiar theme from the SNP, and perhaps during Mark MacDonald's own contribution he'll set out what of the £2.5 billion worth of welfare spending he is committed to seeing reinstated post-independence should that come to pass. But Of course, on pensions too, the Coalition Government has introduced progressive reform, the so-called triple lock, which links pension increases to inflation wages of 2.5%, whichever is highest, has already delivered the highest cash increase to the state pension. A far cry from the 75p increase offered by Gordon Brown, which caused such fury not so long ago. A far cry too from the extravagant promises made by the SNP about pensions in a separate Scotland. Backed by no evidence, these assertions offer no response to the concerns raised by many independent experts, including the Institute of Chartered Accountants. As with pensions and income tax, so too on childcare, we've seen the Coalition Government acting to provide much-needed support. The package south of the border now includes free provision for 130,000 or 20% of 2-year-olds from the most deprived backgrounds, rising to 40% next year. And from 2015, the UK Government will meet 20% of childcare costs for working families, rising to £1,200 per child under the age of 12 per year, once the scheme has been fully implemented, going some way to meeting the demands of Save the Children and others. And on fuel costs, we've seen the welcome confirmation of a further freeze in the fuel duty over the next 2 years. Of course, with every price hike, efforts by both Scotland's governments to combat fuel poverty are set back. But the only long-term solution is to step up work to improve energy efficiency, notably across our existing housing stock, and ensure we meet our renewables target. That is why the price cap proposed by Ed Miliband is a concern. It would be a costly temporary fix, drawing vital investment away from the sort of measures that are essential as part of a long-term solution to fuel poverty and emissions reduction. It should also be recalled that when Ed Miliband became Climate Secretary in 2008, he said he would, quote, press energy firms for price cuts. As Angela Constance reminded us, when he left office, energy company profits had soared and average bills were up by over 30%. But it's not just about building fairness into our system of tax and pensions or providing support to hard-pressed families and individuals struggling with childcare or fuel costs. We also need to prepare the ground for building a stronger economy. That's why my amendment highlights the work of the Coalition Government to extend apprenticeship opportunities, support science and research and ensure investment is made in the new green economy.
Final minute.
Of course, more needs to be done, but these measures demonstrate a willingness by the Government to address structural problems in our economy in a way that also locks in fairness. The Scottish Government will argue that it is taking steps itself to mitigate the impact of rising costs, and I don't disagree. However, bizarrely, SNP ministers seem to believe that they are wholly responsible for any money that is spent in Scotland, but entirely blameless for any money that isn't. This is simply not credible. Government is about choices. If SNP ministers choose to spend in one area or in one way, it restricts what they can do in other areas. And I note that Alex Neil's amendment also sets out a number of areas, including the introduction of free personal care delivered by the previous Lib Dem Labour executive, history being rewritten before our very eyes. Predictably, he then goes on to argue that it will all be different with independence. But the contortions the SNP wish to perform with what economic levers are left after ceding control of the currency would defy even the most esteemed of Nobel laureates. In trying to persuade increasingly sceptical voters of the case for separation, the SNP has racked up an impressive and growing list of costly commitments. Yet the only tax commitment they've made is to reduce corporation tax. The Greens, at least, have the intellectual honesty of acknowledging if you want to spend more, you need to tax and borrow more. But that response means to look to the long term. Too often, however, the SNP's obsession with next year's referendum has encouraged them to opt for short-term fixes.
Could I ask you to move your amendment, please?
I think I did it earlier.
Thank you. We now turn to the open debate, and I call, first of all, John Wilson to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm, and I have to indicate it's very tight speeches of 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to debate the Labour Party motion on the cost of living. I realise this follows on from a well-developed theme that was unveiled to the public and Labour Party members at the Labour Party conference in Brighton last week. It's also the day after the latest increase of the national minimum wage of 12p an hour, on a percentage terms 1.9%. This is in many ways an important debate, since it shows the crisis centred on the cost of living leads to a wider discussion on economic growth and what type of society we want to live in, especially one where a growing inequality in society has been encouraged over recent decades, particularly impacting on families and individuals on the lowest incomes and suffering the worst effects of poverty. I had to pinch myself last week and realise how times have changed. I remember in my previous employment attending meetings of the TUC National Minimum Wage Enforcement Group and speaking to officers from the Inland Revenue and the DWP discussing the impact that the minimum wage could have on people's lives. And I also remember being phoned in 2006 by consultants asking who I thought would make the best chair or the incoming chair of the Low Pay Commission. And I suggested Rodney Bickerstaff. Now, 2006 was a time when the Labour Party were in power. I suggested Rodney Bickerstaff because I felt it would be better to have someone who had a real commitment to low-paid families and a real commitment to the national minimum wage. Unfortunately, the then Labour government decided Rodney Bickerstaff was not the person to lead the Low Pay Commission. Instead, they once again appointed someone from the private sector to take on that role. So the Low Pay Commission does have an important role in setting the national minimum wage, but is a role that has been hampered because of the business interests that actually put the dead hand to ensure that minimum wage does not rise in line with the commitments that have been given by this Scottish Government to introduce the living wage to every worker in the government service. And the reality is, and I made the intervention to Jackie Bailey, genuinely made the intervention to Jackie Bailey in terms of the setting of the minimum wage. When the minimum wage was introduced, it was introduced at £3.60 an hour. The trade union movement at that time asked for a rise of £5 an hour and were rejected. And the reality is, and when you do the calculations, if the minimum wage increases that have taken the same impact as they had when the minimum wage was introduced, then we would be talking about a minimum wage at the present moment in excess of £7 an hour, which would have a real impact on those in low incomes. I also find myself more surprised that, according to well-informed commentators, even the present number 10 policy unit realises that any economic growth is not making an impact on all sectors and areas of the economy, particularly for those in low-paid employment. There is even talk of number 10 wanting to seriously examine the possibility of increasing the national minimum wage. But as is always the case in British politics, the dead hand of the Treasury is apparently resisting such an attempt. I appreciate that some members will know that I had a members' debate on the Oxfam report, Our Economy, in this chamber at the start of September. One of the many striking statistics from that report was a reference to the past 20 years, which has seen the top 1% of earners in the UK in 25 years incomes increases of up to 117% in real terms, compared to just 47% increases in the poorest 10%. On the issue of energy prices, I have previously stated in this chamber that ordinary consumers have not been best served so far in the current marketplace for energy, particularly electricity. In the period since 2004, there has been a percentage increase of over 60% in electricity bills. I, along with others, recognised back in May 2011 that the big six energy companies need to be held to account by the public for their continual energy price hikes, particularly in light of the impact the price hikes have on low-income households and tackling fuel poverty. As a member of at the time of the Economy, Energy Tourism Committee, it was important to scrutinise this issue and the pricing behaviour of the energy companies.
Final minute.
Ofgem, at the present time, do not have the powers to peg energy prices. And I welcome the commitment by Ed Miliband, if he does get into power, to actually peg these prices. But we have a real opportunity to make changes next year and to set the agenda for the future of Scotland, a future that will tackle the real issues of deprivation, of poverty, and end once and for all the situation that we've actually encountered being part of this better together great union that is the United Kingdom. Because clearly the policies over the past 20, 30 years have not had this real impact on those living in poverty. And when we see today fuel poverty increasing, then we have got to question whether or not there is another way, and that other way is a choice for the people of Scotland next year to take the powers, the real powers, into their own hands and get a government that's prepared to deliver on policies that benefit everyone in society, not just the 1% top earners.
Thank you. Before I call Malcolm Chisholm, I must advise the Chamber that I will have to cut members off at 6 minutes. Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by
Officer, the background to the debate today is the fact that in 38 out of the last 39 months since the coalition government was elected, prices have been rising faster than wages. And some of those factors clearly are beyond the UK government's or indeed the Scottish government's control. But I think the background to it is that the economic policy of the UK government has failed. And I think that was well summed up by Mark Carney, the new governor of the Bank of England, who's obviously politically independent. But he said fiscal adjustment has been a drag on growth. And it's really economic failure that underlines the problem and the crisis in the cost of living. Now, clearly, Labour and SNP have responded differently to this. Many of the policy prescriptions we have may be similar, but the SNP clearly have used it as part of their constitutional argument, and we saw that again in Angela Constance's speech today. And I think the other thing that the SNP do as part of their referendum strategy is to say that really there is no alternative at a UK level and that basically Labour and the Tories are the same. And again, I think that theme came through in Angela Constance's speech when he said that there had been no difference in relation to child poverty under the present government and the current government. And that is simply untrue because, of course, child poverty levels fell very significantly under the last Labour government because that was a priority for the last Labour government. And if anyone doubted the differences between Labour and Conservative, then clearly the speech by Ed Miliband and indeed the other speeches by Ed Balls and others last week highlighted the very significant policy differences between Labour and Conservative now, so that the people of the UK will have a very clear choice at the next UK election. I was pleased to hear Angela Constance say that at least she believed the energy freeze proposal was well-intentioned, because it's not what Mike Weir or any other SNP minister or MP has said in the last few days. So I very much welcome that. She said that it would be better if Ed Miliband had had a better record as Energy Minister. I actually point out that energy prices fell by £100 on average when he was Energy Minister. But he himself would admit, of course, that the fundamental changes that he wants to make, he didn't make at that time, because it's through the experience of the operation of the energy market that he realises that he has to reset that market. And of course, that is the other key ingredient of that policy, apart from the price freeze. And it also shows something wider, that actually Ed Miliband is willing to challenge vested interests. He's willing to take on and question the neoliberal consensus. And he is showing that he is making a very significant break with that consensus in economic policy. And I would argue to SNP members they should look at the economic policy stance of Labour at a UK level. And I would argue that while it's not traditional socialism, it is actually radical. It is a left-wing policy, and I would argue far to the left of their economic policy, because in general they are far more comfortable about cozying up to big business. They do propose big cuts in corporation tax and so on. Now, of course, it wasn't just in relation to energy that we had exciting announcements last week. Childcare, I think, is something that the Scottish Government could look at very closely. I support, of course, what they're proposing on 600 hours, but really that pales into the shade when you compare it with what Labour has been proposing at a UK level and what we have said we would implement if we were the government in Scotland, namely the 25 hours for anyone who has parents working of their 3- and 4-year-olds, and of course the massive extension of after-school care. And again, I think it was very interesting, just to take a third example about what we were saying about housing at UK level. You have to deal with supply, and yet it's a red light on the Scottish Government indicators housing supply. So I think the SNP should look very carefully at what Labour was proposing at UK level and stop spreading the myth that somehow any government, a UK government at Westminster, will be the same. Now let's turn our attention to what the Scottish Government is or should be doing. I think, in general, we would say that we want to help the many at the expense of the few, and that could be seen going through, for example, the energy policy, the childcare policy, in terms of the taxation of the ultra-rich that would be part of those. But I think our doubts about the council tax policy is that it does support the many, but it is at the expense of council services, which do benefit disproportionately those on lower income. So that is why it is different the energy policy is fundamentally different in principle from the council tax freeze policy. Now, Jackie Baillie and others, of course, have talked about fuel poverty, the food banks, the bedroom tax in particular, which is so to the fore of the public's concerns at the moment, and how the Scottish Government could do more there. But it was very interesting if people look at what happened at the Finance Committee this morning, because this, among other things, poverty policy from the Scottish Government was discussed there. And Jim McCormick, for example, of the Roundtree Foundation, says Scotland doesn't appear to have a delivery plan for its child poverty strategy. Studying the indicators, the 50 indicators that the Scottish Government has, we have only 2 that are focused on poverty. We know that growth is not the only factor, it's the distribution of wealth. So why is there not one of the indicators that targets, for example, medium household disposable income? That would show a concern for the cost of living for the majority of people. And why is there nothing about poverty in the guidance on SOAs to community planning partnerships? Again, it's not joined up the poverty strategy with what's demanded of local authorities. So there's a great deal more that the government could do to focus on poverty in its policy priorities and in its guidance to local authorities.
Many thanks. I now call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too am pleased to have been called to speak in this debate this afternoon on the cost of living and the impact that has on both hard-pressed families and indeed hard-pressed individuals in Scotland. And can I, like the Minister did, start with the very key issue of child poverty? And I would like to say that it is absolutely unacceptable to me that nearly 1 in 5 children in Scotland is being brought up in poverty. 1 in 5 children in oil-rich Scotland. What a disgrace, Presiding Officer, and how inexcusable it is for the no parties to campaign together. That is Labour and Tories campaigning happily together to try to stop Scotland getting the powers that we need to actually tackle such inequality in our country. For it is quite clear that in order to create the prosperous and socially just country that Scotland can be, we need control over all of our resources to ensure that they are put to work for all of our people. And it is also quite clear that we need the full toolkit of powers that other independent countries take for granted to tackle inequality. And it is worth noting here, Presiding Officer, that countries, I would like to make a wee bit more progress, but I'll bear it in mind, but worth noting, Presiding Officer, that countries like Denmark and Norway, both independent countries, similar populations to Scotland, have child poverty levels at less than 10%. Now, that's not 0%, Presiding Officer, that's where I'd like to go, but it is certainly much better than being subject to the policies of Westminster, where we see the UK as being the 4th most unequal country in the developed world. I'll take Ms Baillie now if she wishes.
Jackie Baillie.
Would the member acknowledge that child poverty fell by a greater extent in Scotland in the first 2 terms of the Scottish Parliament than it has done since? Therefore, it is not just about powers, but it's also about the priorities that government applies to things.
Annabel Ewing.
Well, I thank Ms Baillie for her intervention. I mean, ultimately, it's all to do with power, who controls your resources as to what decisions you can then take. But, of course, it is interesting to note that in terms of the IFS report of 2011 on poverty and inequality in the UK, that they found that income inequality rose during the 13 years of Labour government in Westminster across a range of potential measures. I think we should remember history, not seek to rewrite the facts. But with a yes vote in September 2014, ending child poverty is truly one of the big prizes of independence for Scotland. But in the meantime, Presiding Officer, this SNP Scottish Government is doing all it can within the limited powers that are currently available to help people through these tough economic times. And that can be seen in the continuing commitment to the social wage, which of course is helping folk in striving to keep one step ahead, to juggle the household finances and come out on top week in, week out. That is the challenge that faces them. And we see that, for example, we've heard this afternoon with the council tax freeze, a freeze that has been in place for the last 6 years in a row, a freeze that makes a big difference to people because it is the one bill they know will not go up when they look at all their other household bills. And it is also a big relief, Presiding Officer, as compared to what went before, because when we had Labour and the Liberals, we saw a staggering 60% plus increase in council tax bills. So I think it is certainly clear, no thank you to folk, that the massive council tax hike under Labour did nothing whatsoever to help people deal with the increasing cost of living. Of course, another key aspect of the social social wage commitment that the SNP government has made to the people of Scotland is the abolition of the tax on ill health that was prescription charges. The SNP government was proud to go back to the founding principles of our National Health Service and to make the NHS truly free at the point of need. And to the critics of this help, and it is difficult to believe that there are critics of this help to hard-pressed individuals and families struggling with the increasing cost of living. But what kind of world do these critics live in, where they think that helping people with conditions that require constant prescriptions who are earning less than £16,000 a year is somehow providing this immense subsidy and largesse? What utter nonsense, and it shows a lack of real understanding of the challenges that individuals are facing. But in the time left, Presiding Officer, there are many other aspects of the social wage that hopefully will be touched on this afternoon, such as free personal nursing care, free NHS eye examinations, education based on the ability to learn and not the ability to pay, concessionary bus travel, the abolition of bridge tolls. I could go on, Presiding Officer. All of these measures are in place now and are making an impact now to people's lives, and they are allowing people to keep more of their own money in their own pockets. We should not, of course, forget the living wage and the SNP government's commitment to introduce that wherever possible, the no compulsory redundancy policy, and, of course, the efforts we are taking to mitigate the Westminster government's welfare reforms. But in conclusion, Presiding Officer, it is clear that whilst the government is straining every sinew in terms of the powers that it has to help people through difficult times, what we do need are the powers that every other country takes for granted. For who would be content simply to mitigate the decisions of others? Rather, we should be taking these decisions ourselves. 140 countries have chosen independence since 1945, and not one of those countries has ever asked to give it up again. Not one country. That is the way forward for Scotland. That is the way to create a prosperous and a fair society. That is the better future for Scotland. And all we have to do, Presiding Officer, is to say yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now call Kezia Dugdale to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I can start my remarks by making a few comments about child poverty and childcare. The key to decent childcare is the fact that it addresses child poverty. It's key to economic growth and it's key to gender equality. And I would say to Angela Constance and to Annabel Ewing, you really need to go back and look at the independent statistics, because child poverty fell under Labour between 1999 and 2005. It then stabilised, and then the SNP came into power and child poverty went up. Child poverty has only ever gone down under Labour and up under the SNP. And I'm afraid that's a fact that she just cannot deny. Can I encourage the Government to take a moment and have a look at Save the Children's recent report, Give Us a Hand with Childcare, which contains 10 key messages from parents around Scotland about what childcare means to them and how it must be best delivered to benefit their lives. 4 key points from that stood out for me. The cost of childcare is too high, particularly for low-income parents. Parents have a strong desire to work but feel trapped by the cost of childcare. Flexibility is key, and childcare is a particular challenge for parents wishing to study. Now, can I say to the Government, I'll be taking those clear messages to the Children and Young People Bill. That's 100 voices in the Save the Children report, all very clearly stating what they want from the childcare provision that this Government is bringing forward. And they have, of course, said that they are going to extend childcare to 600 hours for looked-after 2-year-olds and to all 3- and 4-year-olds, a move which the Scottish Labour Party supports, presuming that it's properly funded. This was, of course, a promise that the SNP made in 2007, and 6 years on, we're still waiting for it to happen. The Government tell us that we need a bill actually now to make it happen, and that's why we're currently legislating. So I must say I was a bit surprised to see the SNP tweeting this morning an infographic, no doubt connected to the Dunfermline by-election, where they say that they have saved families £701 a year. The Minister used the same figure in her opening remarks by delivering 600 hours of free childcare. So I'd love to hear from the Minister how 6 years on, with a bill still in place to deliver 600 hours, she's putting out leaflets saying it's already happened. So just for the record, Presiding Officer, there's no response there. I'd love to hear the answer, Mr Gibson.
Kenneth Gibson.
Hours was a 2011 commitment, not a 2007 commitment.
No.
And it's going to be 187.5 hours more than Labour had in 8 years they were in power.
Kezia Dugdale.
I'm afraid Kenneth Gibson is just incorrect, and if he goes back to his office and looks up...
Could I have Ms Dugdale's microphone, please?
I'm afraid the member is just incorrect. If he goes back to his office and looks up the 2007 manifesto from his own party, he'll see a very clear commitment to the 600 hours. And it's 7 years on. 7 years on now. It'll be August 2014 before your government delivers the 600-hour commitment. So just quite why you're putting leaflets out and tweeting all over Twitter this morning that this has already happened, I don't know. It is deeply cynical, and it's the type of deeply cynical politics I talked about in the chamber last week. In that same speech, Presiding Officer, I brought up the issue of payday loans, and I'm going to do so again today. I make no apology for it, and I'll do it again and again until this government listens and decides to do something about it. A recent survey into what people use payday loans for showed that the vast majority of people, more than any other particular topic, use payday loans to buy food and to pay bills. That's a shocking statistic. But I've thrown hundreds of statistics at this government around the problem of payday loans and all the different things that they could do about it, and it's fallen on deaf ears. So I want to tell them briefly about a story of one of my constituents, a guy called James. If you want to see the full story of James's experiences, you can go on my website and see a full 10-minute interview. James borrowed £200 to buy extra Christmas presents a year and a half ago. That £200 debt that he borrowed, he couldn't keep up with, so he took out another payday loan to pay that first one off. Within a matter of months, he had £5,000 worth of debt to 5 different payday lenders. Every single penny of his wage, and not insubstantial wage, I might remind the government, was going out to pay payday loan debt, and it was all disappearing from his bank account through continuous payment authorities. That guy was on the edge of bankruptcy, and this government have got absolutely nothing to say to my constituent. I have put dozens of ideas forward to this government. Of course, Mr Mason.
John Mason.
Well, I just wonder if the member would like to spell out to us what she thinks should be done.
Kezia Dugdale.
I'm delighted to send Mr Mason every single speech I've made on this topic in this chamber, and perhaps then he might listen. Glasgow City Council are a fantastic example of action that can be taken on payday loans. They have 20 different recommendations on this issue, one of which was released 3 weeks ago, and that was to slash rents for payday loan companies, the alternatives of credit unions, and to slash their rents and their business rates. That's just one of 20 things. No, thank you, Mr MacDonald.
Final
one of 20 things that Glasgow City Council are doing. If I can ask this government to do one thing, and I can see the Health Minister in his place, the Health Minister spends millions of pounds every year on health warnings. He tells people through the social advertising budget, don't drink too much, don't eat fatty foods, eat 5 fruit and veg a day. I have put to this government on several occasions an idea for wealth warnings. I want to see leadership from this government that will stand up and say, payday loans are bad for you. There are alternatives and there are debt advice services that you can access. He can do that within the powers that he has. But time and time again, Presiding Officer, they are not willing to act. For far too many families around the country, there is far too much month left at the end of the money, and this government have got nothing to say to them, and it's an absolute scandal. If he does one thing in the run-up to Christmas, this government should speak out against payday loan companies and give people a chance of a better future that isn't built on the debt that he's quite happy to sit back and watch build up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Drew Smith.
Well, of course, we in these benches know that the payday loan companies now to really deal with them is reserved, of course, to Westminster, and Kezia Dugdale and our colleagues don't want us to have those powers. I mean, I put down a motion in 2010 calling for the then Labour government to deal with these high-interest charges. Not a single Labour MSP dealt with it. It's nothing but cynical hypocrisy from the Labour member. And to talk about child poverty, we've 10.9% less in terms of resource to actually deal with this, to deal with child poverty than we actually inherited. I will let you in, but let me make progress, and I will let you in, Kezia, because you let me in. The cost of living is a pressure issue for families and individuals, and unemployment is too high. Benefits are under attack from the coalition. The UK state pension is one of the worst in Europe relative to wages. Fuel costs are amongst the highest in the world, and many in work face real terms wage cuts and reduced working hours. No one deny that since the recession, people across these islands have had to make a lot less go a lot further. However, even before recession struck, household incomes were under threat from the then UK Labour government. The Why Do We Feel So Broke report, published on the 4th of February 2008, showed that average UK disposable family income, after tax and housing costs, having declined from £16,544 in 2003 to £16,305 in 2006, plummeted to £15,231 in 2007, a fall of 6.6% in a single year. This, at a time of strong worldwide economic growth, shows the economic incompetence of Labour in power. By contrast, since 2007, despite increasingly difficult Westminster budget settlements, the SNP government has achieved much. The Labour motion rightly points to areas where costs have soared, energy and childcare being two examples. They also say that both the UK and Scottish governments must act urgently to tackle these issues. Again, little to argue with. Nevertheless, the track record of both governments is markedly different. Whilst restrictions imposed on this one severely limits what we're able to do, a situation those on the no benches are reluctant to change. The council tax freeze has saved average households up to £1,600, while in England council tax bills have risen year on year. And in North Ayrshire, where I'm an MSP, Labour raised the council tax by 75% in the decade to 2007, while water and sewerage bills soared by an astonishing 592%. And lest we forget, fuel duty in the first 3 years of the Blair government was increased 6% each year above the rate of inflation, making our economy increasingly uncompetitive, which is no doubt one of the reasons why Scotland lost 37% of its manufacturing employment while Labour were in power. Scotland would undoubtedly be hit by further tax hikes were Labour in power, but no one really knows. Indeed, I doubt many Labour members have a clue what their council tax policy is this week. In 2010, then Labour leader Ian Gray said the council tax freeze was unsustainable, but reversed his position prior to elections, saying that now is not the right time to increase the burden on household budgets. This, of course, begs the question, when is the right time, Mr Gray?
Ian Gray.
I'd like to ask what the SNP's policy on local taxation is. I believe it's still to introduce the local income tax. Could you confirm that for me?
Kenneth Gibson.
The SNP policy is indeed when the time is right to introduce a local income tax. Of course it is. Well, we've frozen council tax, but you're a yo-yo party on this issue. Glasgow City Council has actually pledged to increase the freeze the council tax for a year longer than this government will even be in office. And Labour introduced tuition fees, forcing many young people who wanted to go to university to save or go into debt, while the SNP government reintroduced a proud tradition of access to education based on the ability to learn, not the ability to pay. Our commitment to free school meals, a living wage, to maintain the bus pass for older people and the abolition of prescription charges has helped ease the strain on household budgets at this difficult time. In Joanne Lammett's view, these services are part of a something-for-nothing culture, a phrase used at the Tory conference yesterday by Ian Duncan-Smith, and all are under the scrutiny of our Cuts Commission. For Labour to demand the SNP government do more to reduce the cost of living when they consistently attack or threaten to reverse the very measures helping so many Scots beggars belief. The real power to reduce the cost of living lies at Westminster. Control over energy policy is key to reducing fuel costs. Radical benefit reform would help those struggling to find work, while a decent pension would allow our older people to enjoy later life without worrying about heating their homes or eating properly. If they're serious about addressing the cost of living, why don't opposition MPs want the tools for us to do the jobs here, instead of tinkering around the edges, trying to mitigate the impact of UK governments? Tell us to deliver change, but they never do. On Labour's watch, the UK became one of the most unequal countries in the developed world, and their claim to be progressive is a myth debunked 80 years ago, as the Iraq War, Trident, retention of the House of Lords, tuition fees and trickle-down economics attest. And last week, Ed Miliband promised to take action on energy companies. One wonders what his plan is, how effective it will be, and importantly, why he didn't address these matters when in power. Ed Miliband was, of course, Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change for 2 years. Ineffective doesn't begin to describe his tenure in office. Although in taking up post, he did very politely ask the big 6 energy companies to take voluntary action to ensure prices were fair. Age concern and national energy action slated Labour for, and I quote, failing to protect the poorest and most vulnerable for high energy bills. His own department's figures show that fuel poverty continued to rise, and Westminster's Energy and Climate Change Committee reported that the Labour government missed its own fuel poverty reduction targets. What a record. Ofgem figures show that during 13 years of Labour UK government, while average prices rose 48%, gas bills increased 67% and electricity a whopping 139%. It's astonishing that Labour demands action to reduce the cost of living given their abysmal record in government and opposition. The SNP government is doing what it can within the powers that we have, but Scots should vote yes to change it. And what I would say to Labour today, it's not what you say in this chamber now that matters, it's what you did in government that we actually can see. Unless you plan to reverse Tory cuts, you know, your words are meaningless. Unless you tell us how you will fund it, your rhetoric is empty.
The member must finish.
Labour speeches What about action rather than speech? I noticed you wanted to come in after
Order,
6 minutes were up.
please.
And can I just apologise, President Officer, to Kezia Dugdale? I did say I'd take her in, and unfortunately I didn't manage to do that.
I'm afraid to tell the Chamber we're going to lose a member from this debate. We're well over time. I now call Drew Smith to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The action that the previous Labour Government took was to reduce child poverty, and it is nonsensical of members of the SNP to pretend that that somehow didn't happen. In recent weeks and months, a number of people have said to me that Scottish politics is dominated by the ongoing referendum debate, and indeed the Scottish Government have used time in this chamber in recent weeks to debate the one-year-to-go point until Scots have their say on that question. And I think no one on this side would underestimate the importance of the referendum, but I think across the chamber, actually, I think we would all regret any impression that this Parliament is not focused on the day-to-day issues which affect the lives of the people that we represent, and I hope that this Labour debate goes some way to redressing that balance. Because the cost of living crisis, which is hitting households across Scotland and across the UK, was also the issue which dominated my surgeries this summer. Lynn was a woman who came to a surgery I held in Partick, and her story was fairly typical of many people that I met. Lynn was forced to give up her work as a supervisor in a busy shop to care for her elderly mother. Lynn's mum then unfortunately died in January, and since then she's been unable to find another job, and I do mean any other job. So Lynn did the right thing by caring for her mum herself, saved the state money, but now she feels like she's been punished, and for her life is just getting harder each and every month. We know that the impact of the global financial crash and recession has been felt hardest and longest by those most far removed from the questions of financial regulation. It has been bank workers, not bank executives, who felt the pain most, those who have lost their jobs in banking, in manufacturing and retail, and 49,000 in public services have suffered. Those who were already furthest from the labour market have been penalised heavily, and even for those in work, exploitation has been the hallmark of this recovery, such as it is. Zero-hour contracts, reduced hours and pay freezes have been the reward for many of those who are in work, while those looking for a job have been encouraged, or in some cases actually compelled, to provide their labour without pay. At best, this might mean less money in purses and wallets, putting off home moves and improvements, missing out on a holiday. But at worst, it means struggling to clothe your children for the new school term or to put food on the table. And at the same time, we've seen childcare become less and less affordable, and it is now less affordable in Scotland than in any other part of the United Kingdom. Prices have risen in the shops and on our household bills. Despite falls in wholesale energy prices, the cost of heating a home this winter will take up a larger and larger proportion of incomes. And when it comes to a basket of essentials in the supermarket, as I think Jackie Bailey said, GRF put that rise at what is paid at the till at some 25% over just 5 years. Demand for food banks has risen by 35% in that same period, and a fifth of those actually accessing a food bank are in work. Since 2010, average wages in Scotland have fallen by £27.30 a week. Public sector workers are emerging from a pay freeze with a 1% increase or a 2% for those who already earn least. Yet CPI is at 2.8% and RPI is at 3.3%. Declining incomes and rising costs add up to a cost of living crisis for real people, and not just a problem or an opportunity for politicians. The question for this Scottish Parliament, I believe, is then how we respond and how we use the powers that the people have entrusted to us to act in their interests. The political parties are all thinking about how we will respond to these problems after the referendum or after the next election, but a crisis is not a challenge of tomorrow, it is for today, and our response should be an urgent one. And that is, I think, Presiding Officer, where I take issue with the amendment which has been put in front of us today. Because the truth is that the Scottish Government have got nothing new to say. What we've heard is a restatement of policies which were debated in the 2007 election, or policies which were actually introduced by the previous Labour-led government before 2007. What we need now to do is to evaluate what has already been done in terms of regulating cost and spending to help people. On both, we must consider whether it is working or whether some effects of these policies are actually unintended or contrary to our objective, and consider whether a reprioritisation is possible or needed. And lastly, we need to set out more about what could and should be done. And there are plenty of things that could. Extending the living wage, taking action on zero-hour contracts, and making the case for training which leads to better quality of work. These are all vital, and I agree with what has already been said about them. On zero-hour contracts, I received an answer to a parliamentary question which is published in today's Business Bulletin. And that says, which says that in our colleges and universities, which are some of the biggest employers in the city that I represent, no assessment has been made as to how extensively these zero-hour contracts are being used, or whether they're primarily used for teaching and academic staff, or whether it's cleaners, technicians, maintenance workers or cooks in the canteen who are on them. So if we don't even know how many people are being asked to work in a university, not knowing how many hours they might get next week, then what hope have we got to create decent employment in other sectors of the economy? Fuel poverty, presiding officer, has been mentioned by others, and it is an area which is significantly the responsibility of this Scottish Government, and about which their commitment is regularly extolled, and we've heard some of that today. And I do welcome every penny that is spent on helping those 1 in 3 Scots who live in fuel poverty. But yeah, one of the first decisions taken after the election that brought me here was actually to cut the fuel poverty budget, and indeed to remove universal provision from the central heating programme, which SNP members have praised in other areas. Presiding officer, I do just want to finish on a policy which was announced at the Labour conference last week, and that is Labour's proposal to freeze energy bills. Would the SNP support the next Labour government on this, or would they implement a similar plan in an independent Scotland? That is the key question of this debate. Members will know my view and that of others on these benches about SNP plans for cutting corporation tax for these same big businesses. So can I ask the Minister in closing, how could you justify cutting the tax for these energy companies, but take no action on the bills which are being demanded of their customers? If you can't answer that question in this debate, then I'm afraid it will become a very big question in the referendum debate up to the 18th of September next year. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Now call on John Mason to be followed by Patrick Harvey. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank Labour for bringing this important subject for debate today. We got a number of briefings, and one of them was from the Child Poverty Action Group, which are an organisation I think very highly of. And I have to say I agree with the direction of travel in their briefing, which is that one of the things we need to be doing is maximising the income, and the other is minimising the essential outgoings for families in Scotland. I think it's particularly disappointing to read in their briefing that we still have 20% of children living in poverty, and this is forecast to rise by another 65,000 by 2020. By contrast, the child poverty legislation around about 2010, which I think we all supported, both here and at Westminster, was meant to cut child poverty to only 10% by 2020. I have to say I thought even that was unambitious, given that other European countries are well below 10%. But the warning at the time was that Westminster legislation without resources was not going to eradicate child poverty, and sadly that has proven to be the case. So firstly, on the point of maximising income, my first point would be that we need to get the living wage is good, but a statutory minimum wage is better. We struggle to impose or try and get people to take part in a voluntary living wage, whereas a statutory minimum wage is compulsory in all, both private sector and public sector. Secondly, people need a minimum to live on. We give that to prisoners, and we should be prepared to give that to everyone else. That part of somebody's income should be unconditional, and only any income on top of that should be conditional. That's why it's so wrong to take money off people who have an extra bedroom, taking them below the level that they actually need to live on. Similarly, making people attend a job centre 5 days a week in order to get their benefits. So for those who would say that independence is a distraction from the main issues, like poverty and the cost of living, my answer is that I want independence so that we can stop struggling to impose a voluntary living wage, and we can increase the statutory minimum wage to a proper level that people can actually live on. Secondly, the area of minimising essential outgoings. Yes, absolutely.
Drew Smith.
I'm very interested in what the member says. I wonder if you could confirm whether that is Scottish National Party policy and at what level the SNP would seek to put the minimum wage.
Well, I'm happy to argue that the statutory minimum wage should be the same, the $7.45 that the living wage is on at the moment. I don't think anybody has fixed a figure for that. But we repeatedly, when I was at Westminster, we repeatedly voted I spoke for a higher statutory minimum wage. On the question of reducing outgoings, we can hardly go very far in this debate, and it's come up already today, that before we hit the challenge of where extra money is to come from, where is that extra money to come from? If it's a free healthy lunch for rich kids, is that the best use of resources? Where is the money to come from for more childcare? Now, in energy, let's not forget that we are seeing good things happening already, albeit sometimes on a small scale. For example, in the Commonwealth Games Village, we have a district heating system, we have higher insulation levels, so that you go into a room in one of the new homes and they have a tiny radiator, and that's going to be the case for some 700 homes, including a number which will be social rented. So that is good news. However, this is on a relatively small scale, and building homes like that is not yet economically viable, and it comes at a cost, at a subsidy from the public purse. Now, energy costs are not helped by having a profit element. It would have been better if gas and electricity had not been privatised. I deliberately did not take any of the shares when they were privatised. And I really have reservations about whether Labour can deliver on this idea of an energy price freeze. One fear is that it would stifle investment in future energy requirements, and another fear is that the companies would just raise their prices dramatically before the freeze came into effect. What the Scottish Government, in partnership with local government, has delivered on is the council tax freeze. Of course, if council tax was raised, there would be more money for services. But let's remember, as Drew Smith pointed out earlier on, that council tax is a regressive tax. It hits those on limited incomes hardest, for example, pensioners. So freezing council tax helps these same people on fixed incomes. I already have, if you don't mind. Of course, longer term, we want to replace council tax with something fairer, based on ability to pay, but in the meantime, a freeze is very welcome. Now, I think it is worth saying here that there are some good points in some of the amendments. For example, the Greens demand reduction and waste reduction, and absolutely we should go down that route, definitely. And the Lib Dems also mention overseas aid, which may be slightly off the point of the main motion, but I think every time we talk about poverty, we should remember those around the world who are in much poorer state than we are. I'd like just to make a few comments too on the exchange rate. One of the reasons for costs going up is that the value of the pound has been falling. And the value of the pound has fallen because the economy has been badly managed over a long number of years. There was much rejoicing when the pound fell from around 70 pence to the euro to more like 80 pence. And that was meant to boost exports, although in practice I do not think we have seen much growth, at least at a UK level. But the falling exchange rate has meant that anything imported now costs more. And for this country, that means quite a lot of things are costing more. So while we may accept that some aspects of the increased cost of living are out with government's control, all government's control, we have to be clear that this mismanagement of the economy by successive Westminster governments is a major factor in all this too. So let us make dealing with poverty a key focus in this Parliament. But if we are going to hear new proposals from other parties, let us have clear, costed alternatives as we move through the budget process. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Colin Patrick Harvey to be followed by Ken McIntosh. Up to 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Labour are due credit for bringing this debate on the cost of living, and it seems that this conference season, every political party has been tripping over each other to say and to send the message, in tough economic times, we're on your side. Labour's policy of the energy price cap is intriguing. It's probably popular, perhaps even achievable, but it will certainly be a short-term measure. The Labour Party are not proposing national ownership, and therefore in a free market competitive arrangement, price caps in a moment. Price caps will be a short-term measure only. But I can't know whether I support it yet or not, because I haven't seen any of the detail. I don't even know, after some time searching for an explanation, whether it's a retail or a wholesale cap. If it's a retail cap, it'll freeze out the suppliers that the Labour Party welcomed, such as the Co-op, when they entered the energy market.
Just for a point of information, it is a retail freeze, but included in the proposal is a major reform of the wholesale market too. But the key point I wanted to make was that it is indeed a temporary measure in order to allow time to legislate to replace Ofgem with a regulator which will have the power to regulate prices. So a short-term measure in order to introduce a long-term policy.
And the long-term policy is also one which I will be interested to learn about when the policy detail is available. But I still beg the question, what happens about the retailers who are not also energy generators if the price cap is in place on the retail side and the wholesale price goes up? Liberal Democrats in their amendment talk about increasing tax thresholds, and on this one I'm sorry to say that I can't agree it's progressive, because every single one of us, members of this chamber, in the top 2% of society by income, we all benefit from that. And
Johnson.
Threshold for higher rate tax was reduced in order to pay for it. So those of us who are higher rate taxpayers are paying for the increase in the lower rate tax threshold.
Patrick Harvey.
There was nothing to prevent you taking more from higher earners on its own and not approving this measure as well. Only £1 billion of the £17 billion that policy cost has been spent on removing low earners from tax, and nothing has been gained by the poorest in society. The SNP have talked about the social wage, and many of the measures under that banner heading I welcome, except, of course, for the council tax freeze, because, as with other examples of freezing a regressive tax, every member in this chamber has saved money from the council tax freeze. Every member, all of us, well paid in the top fraction of society by income, have saved money, and that itself is the problem. I don't have time. The SNP should be willing to acknowledge that the very many positive policies in the social wage headline need to be paid for. I would be willing to pay more tax. Every single member in this chamber and anybody on a comparable income can afford to pay substantially more tax. I want Scandinavian public services, and I want Scandinavian levels of taxation to pay for them. As for the Conservatives, they seem to be obsessed with the marriage tax break, which will save the handsome sum of £4 a week, but only for around a third of married and civil partner couples, and again will exclude many of those most in need. Its real intention, clearly, is to underline a mean-spirited, judgmental moral hierarchy rather than to help those most in need. But even where these policies are well-intentioned, all of them risk achieving only marginal effect. The problem is one of chronic inequality, which has been growing, as members have mentioned, since the late 70s. It matters more than GDP, this inequality, because sharing the wealth of our country benefits far more people than growing that wealth overall. It's also a problem of a culture of waste and overconsumption. Overconsumption even by those who can afford it the least but are left with little choice. And the solutions will often be found in demand reduction and in creating the capacity for self-reliance and in changing the economic relationships, breaking the stranglehold of multinationals. I offer food as one example. The dominance of the retail giants may well mean a few lost leaders are offered to people, but only once they're being bombarded with advertising telling them to buy overpriced, over-processed, unhealthy products as well. The decline in food skills in our society, coupled with a decline in the time that many people have available to them to cook and to prepare and to grow their own food, is an additional element which results in this change in a relationship from food as a form of nourishment and as a natural product into a commercial product on which people are reliant. And the similar dominance of a handful of multinationals and big businesses can be seen in energy, banking and many other sectors of our economy. Often the solutions will also be found in government action. I don't have time to talk about the many benefits of land value tax in reducing housing costs. I don't have time to talk about the role that private rented sector rent controls could and should play allied to social housing supply. I'll end, Deputy Presiding Officer, by recalling Jackie Bailey's condemnation of the SNP and the Campaign for Independence, calling instead for a change of UK government. And I ask only this: didn't we try that already?
Many thanks. And now calling Ken McIntosh to be followed by James Dornan, up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm at that stage in my family life where I've become a taxi driver for my own kids. I suspect some people will recognise the description, James Dornan clearly. Other younger parents might possibly view it with a slight sense of foreboding. And I should also say in mitigation that it's not that bad. It's actually a chance to, the only chance I get sometimes to catch up with a few of the family members. But the big downside is cost. It cost me £98 to fill up the car this weekend. £98. It's a 7-seater, yes, I've got a lot of kids. But it doesn't seem that long ago that I was horrified when a full tank went above £50, and now it's double that. Presiding Officer, families across Scotland are feeling the pinch from this recession. Whether it's the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, research from Shelter, government statistics, they're all telling us the same story. I want to highlight a different report. It's from ASDA, the ASDA Income Tracker, because it's impossible not to notice the rise in the weekly cost of shopping, the cost of heating the house, the cost of getting to work by bus, train or car. And as I said in the economy debate last week, The ASDA study reveals that the average Scottish household is £990 a year worse off than we were 5 years ago. And that's bad enough by itself, but we're considerably poorer than the UK average, where the average household is around £870 a year worse off. Now, I think a few of the other findings are also worth highlighting. Transport costs are up £654 a year compared to 2008. Housing and utility bills are up 25% from 2008. The under-30s have been hardest hit, with discretionary income down approximately 5% over the last 5 years. And just since 2010, wages have on average been growing at half the rate of inflation. Now, what's even more worrying is that the study forecasts the cost of living to continue to rise and to be almost 18% higher over the next 5 years. Now, that means by 2018, the average UK household could be £1,300 a year worse off. So what can we do about it? Well, I actually thought the party conferences laid out the political choices facing us pretty starkly. We could accept the reality that unregulated free markets do not serve any of us very well. We could intervene on the side of the consumers, the workers and the citizens of this country with, for example, a price freeze on our home heating bills, a new approach to public transport ownership or regulation, and a decisive statement of intent to support small indigenous businesses over large unaccountable corporations. Alternatively, we could, of course, listen to the Tory conference this week and try to find some scapegoats, someone to turn on and to blame for our communal misfortunes. We could blame immigrants, for example, and send vans round telling them all to go home. We could blame criminals and threaten to punish them further if they dare muck up their prison cells. Or better still, why not blame the unemployed and treat them like criminals? Let them pick up litter or do community service for the misfortune of not being able to find a job. In fact, given it is all their fault, let's just go the whole hog and take away their human rights. Because, of course, it's impossible to believe that we would ever need human rights to protect any of us. Unfortunately, Presiding Officer, we don't have to wait until the next Conservative election manifesto. The damage is already being done. With child benefit frozen, other benefits for families and children rising at just 1%, the Child Poverty Action Group have pointed out, and I quote, currently 1 in 5, that's 200,000 of Scotland's children, are officially recognised as living in poverty. The IFS forecasts further massive increases in child poverty, with an estimated 65,000 more children living in poverty in Scotland by 2020. Presiding Officer, I've talked before about how devolution has given us here in Scotland the opportunity to become a beacon for progressive policies. Devolution has allowed us to resist market-driven reforms to our health service, to maintain equity in our education system, to support independence in retirement through free travel and free personal care. Although we spend much of our time disagreeing, we only have to look at the last Labour and SNP election manifestos to see that there is a lot of common ground too. Now, my appeal to the Scottish Government is to join with us on policies that will deliver real and immediate benefits to the Scottish people. Policies that will make a difference to our cost of living today, not in some hypothetical post-2016 world. For example, bus regulation or the awarding of the rail franchise. These are powers at Ministers' disposal right now, and decisions where we could help keep services running in the interest of passengers, not shareholders, keeping prices down. Mr MacDonald.
Mark MacDonald. I would simply say to Mr Macintosh that given that he lost the finance brief on the basis of supporting the social wage policies against the rhetoric of his leader, perhaps he should be the one joining with us.
Ken Macintosh, final minute.
Well, I take that as a handout, an olive branch from the SNP, so perhaps it's given me optimism. I'll suggest another one to Mr MacDonald and his colleagues. Community ownership of renewables. Why are there so few examples of community-owned wind farms when, on paper at least, we all support an extension of this policy? Here's an opportunity to address fuel poverty directly, not just to subsidise a few community initiatives, but to take ownership of energy generation, one of the areas responsible for the largest cost of living increases in recent years. So I would ask the Minister to look at the role, for example, of housing associations. What worries me is that despite our common ground, we seem unable to reach common solutions. Just yesterday, in the Welfare Reform Committee, we talked about the bedroom tax.
Should we draw to a close, please?
I will, Presiding Officer. The majority of members on the committee and the members of the expert group were united in our condemnation. My question is, why don't we do something about it now? We have the powers, we have the very vehicle in the bill being brought forward by my colleague Jackie Bailey. Here is something that will make a real difference to the cost of living of some of our most vulnerable citizens.
You must
we
close,
cannot
please.
wait till 2016. By then it'll be too late. People have been chucked over their houses
Right.
or worse.
Thank you very much.
President
Now
Officer,
call
I
on
support
James
the motion.
Dornan to be followed by Mark McDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've been quite intrigued by the debate so far. I never realised there were so many closet nationalists on the other side of the chamber. Every argument I've heard so far has been an argument for independence. It has talked about the evils of welfare reform, you know, the poor child benefit, energy controls, everything that's out with our control and is in control of Westminster being the cause of the situation we're in just now, and yet Jackie Baillie and her colleagues say, come on, Alec, come on, Angela, get your act together and get this sorted. Let's be real here. The reality is that until we get the powers that we're seeking, and we will get next year, and we're not obsessed with the referendum, we're obsessed with Scotland getting the powers that Scotland require so that Scotland can be the country that Scotland should be. I just want to mention, sorry, I want to go on to Kezia Dugdale, because if I don't, then she'll never forgive me or Kenny, because given that Kenny Gibson never managed to get to her. You made a... Everybody knows the work you do around payday loans, and everybody knows how passionate you are and how caring you are regarding this, and also that there's work being done across the parties with it. But honestly, the case you made was for independence. The problems with the payday loans, the powers that are... And I accept that there are some things that the Scottish Government can and are going to try and do. But the only argument to get rid of payday loans is to have the powers to get rid of payday loans. Certainly I will give way.
Presiding Officer, the SNP and the Labour Party agree on capping the cost of credit being the single thing that you can do to address the payday loan industry. In the debate last week, I put to the SNP how they were going to do that in an independent country if you used the same currency, had the same Bank of England as the Bank of Last Resort, and the same financial regulation system, which you have agreed that you need to have. If you're going to have the same financial regulation system across the United Kingdom, how are you going to cut down on payday loan companies?
James Dornan.
Sorry, I still don't see that as being an argument for anything, actually. I mean, what you're saying is that things are bad just now, but let's just keep them the same. What we're saying is let's get the powers, let's change with the powers we will have then, and we will have the powers to change the payday loan regulation. We don't have the power just now, we will have it after next September. But anyway, let's move on to the motion. You know, the motion asks for both UK governments and the Scottish Government to do what it can to urgently tackle the underlying issues which increase the cost of living. I want to focus on what the Scottish Government are doing specifically to react to the rise in cost of living. Around childcare, which has been mentioned a number of times, the costs are rising far above the increase in inflation, but the Scottish Government has already increased free nursery provision by 20% since 2007, and our Children and Young People Bill will ensure a minimum of 600 hours free, flexible learning and childcare for all 3, 4 and looked after 2-year-olds. This will be the best package of nursery care in the UK, will benefit about 120,000 children in Scotland and will save families on average £700 a year. Where the Scottish Government has the power to make changes to ease the cost of living via changes to childcare, it is already doing so. The second example I want to touch on regards the introduction of a living wage. As my colleagues have already mentioned, the report notes that achieving a minimum standard of living and benefits, other than pension credit, is impossible and is nigh on impossible in the minimum wage. It notes the introduction of a living wage would just provide the amount needed to meet the minimum income standard. Introducing a living wage is not something the Scottish Government can compel the private sector or all of the public sector to do. That power still rests with Westminster. But where this Government can, it has seen to that a living wage is paid as a minimum. The SNP are committed to a living wage, but I noticed there was no similar commitment to it forthcoming from Ed Miliband in his conference speech last week. As my colleagues have already said, the Roundtree report also touches on the rise in council tax across the rest of the UK as being one of the core reasons for the cost of living soaring. This rise is not applicable in Scotland, where they've been frozen since 2007, 2005 in Glasgow, and will continue to be for a lifetime of this Parliament. The policy continues to benefit those in the lowest income bracket who have much less financial security and freedom and are therefore most affected by the soaring cost of living. The Scottish Labour's position on the council tax freeze, a policy that is having demonstrable benefits to the purses of ordinary working Scots, is, like most of their other policies, muddled. And today, Drew Smith showed how confused they are about it. As he was he saying it should rise? To be fair, it's not only the council tax fees that this flip-flopping is seen. One day they clearly support the bedroom tax, given that they introduced it originally for the private sector, and then the next day they don't. Then they're told they cannot say whether they do or they don't support it, and now they've been told that they can say they're against it. Who knows how long this current position will stick? I suppose that depends on Ed. It's important to note that, like with the bedroom tax, many of the foundations that the Conservatives and Lib Dem coalition have built their harmful policies on, which in turn are contributing to this astronomical rise in the cost of living, were laid by the Labour Party at Westminster between 1997 and 2010. And that's why, under Labour, the gap between rich and poor increased greater than ever had before. And don't take my word for it, you just need to look at Liam Byrne's comments about the Tories' latest Bash the Poor scheme, which Ken McIntosh was alluding to when he was trying to attack the Tories in his speech. What he claimed, quite rightly, this was just a rehash of Labour's job guarantee policy. You can see that there's hardly a fag paper between the two main unionist parties. And the Coalition's expansion of these policies is, of course, having a huge impact on not only the cost of living for people across the UK, but also their standard of living. You can't look at one without looking at the other, and the report is clear that standards of living will continue to fall for many because of the proposals outlined by the Conservative Lib Dem government. And you know, when we get told by a rich Conservative Minister, Lord Freud, that he cannot say that the rise in people presenting at food banks is because of the failures by the DWP, but that the rise might simply be because food banks provide an opportunity to get free food, we realise just how far removed from reality those who make these decisions about welfare are. Presiding Officer, while it's clearly the case that the Scottish Government is making changes to help people, yes, they cannot continue to mitigate indefinitely. I believe the time is coming when the people of Scotland will look for that change, will vote yes to independence next year, so that this Parliament does have the power to make the policy changes needed to ameliorate the
Many thanks. Now calling Mark MacDonald. 4.5 minutes, please, Mr MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wasn't quite expecting to be called quite so quickly there. But nonetheless, I'll try and get through this in 4.5 minutes. On the council tax freeze, it has been noted by Professor David Bell in his report Constitutional Change and Inequality in Scotland, where he states the fact that raising council taxes actually raises inequality. So we have it there that the freezing council tax is actually helping those at the lowest end because the proportion of their income that they spend on council tax is greater than the proportion of income that those at the higher income scale pay on council tax. Therefore, a freezing council tax, preventing them from facing a greater burden as a result of rising council tax, benefits them. Now, say on to Ken McIntosh, I was interested in his point around community ownership of renewables, and it's actually something where I do think that we would probably find common cause. When I was a List MSP, I visited the Udney Community Wind Turbine in the parish of Udney, just outside of Aberdeen. What they're doing there is using that turbine to generate income for the community and distributing that via local groups. There are obviously other ways that you can use community renewables. Some of it is to reduce your own energy costs rather than perhaps generating an income for the community. But I do think it is something that needs to be looked at. But there is good work being done out there on community renewables. We maybe need to look, though, at how we expand that. Now, I represent a constituency, Presiding Officer, in a city that, on the face of it, is a very wealthy area. We have high employment in Aberdeen, we have low unemployment in Aberdeen, we have low long-term unemployment in Aberdeen. But there is a mask that covers some of the poverty that exists in the city, and those members who came to campaign in the Donside by-election will be aware of some of the very deprived communities that exist within my constituency, and obviously these are areas which feel the sharp end of some of the cost of living issues that we're discussing today. But there is good work that goes on in my constituency from a range of organisations who are dedicating effort to assisting people at the sharp end, whether it's the Woodside Community Centre hosting a mini market which prices goods at an affordable rate for people in the local community so that they can shop there rather than having to use the supermarkets where often many goods are priced out with their reach. Whether it's the Printfield Community Project, who have a charity shop where none of the items are priced and people are asked what they can afford to pay rather than being priced out of purchasing items. These kind of approaches are helping my constituents in difficult times. But I can't help but think, Presiding Officer, that we would be better served if we looked very carefully at the issue around cause and effect, because the point was made, and I think quite rightly made, that the problems that have been identified in terms of the number of issues that are affecting people in Scotland, the genesis of these, and Jackie Baillie highlighted in her speech, the genesis of these is policy decisions that are being made south of the border in reserved areas. Now, if we were to take on face value the points that Labour members are making, and I don't doubt for one second that members such as Kezia Dugdale are passionate about the issues that they bring to this chamber. But the thing that really gets my goat is the notion that somehow the Labour Party is the one that has a monopoly on compassion, and that somehow we are just a bunch of uncaring, soulless individuals on this side of the chamber whose only focus is on the referendum. I've made the point several times that I'm not in this just to get powers for Scotland and say job done. I'm in this to get powers for Scotland and use those powers to shape a fairer, more equal society for the people who live here. That's what this is about. And to say that we're putting Scotland on pause, no. To say, I've only got 45 seconds left, to say we're putting Scotland on pause and saying wait until after 2014, well, what the Labour Party are essentially saying is you're just going to have to put up with the Tories until 2015, cross your fingers, hope for the best that we get our act together as a Westminster party and then get into power. And then, not only that, but that we then do the things that we said we were going to do beforehand. Now, we've learned our lesson, hopefully, from 1997, when the first thing that the Labour Party did when they inherited power in 1997 was continue Tory spending policies, continue Tory benefit cuts. Indeed, I see Malcolm Chisholm in the chamber, who resigned as a minister because of the fact that the Labour government of 1997 continued the benefit cuts that were envisaged by the Conservatives. So we really ought to have learned our lesson from 1997, that the Labour Party will tell the people of Scotland that all will be fixed by a Labour government, but all we've seen is the very opposite in evidence.
Many thanks for sticking to your time, and my apologies to Christian Allard, who I was unable to call. And we now move to winding up speeches, and I call on Liam MacArthur, 6 minutes, up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's been predictably a passionate debate, often more heat than light, although I'd draw particular attention to Kezia Dugdale, Drew Smith and John Mason's speeches, which were passionate but I think constructive. John Mason politely inquired if the reference in my own amendment to the UK Government's commitment to 0.7% of national income on overseas aid may be slightly out of place, and I perhaps had half an eye on Jackie Bailey's other debate this week on challenging poverty. As for today's contribution from Jackie Bailey, it was I was left wondering what it is that she's looking for. She may be right that the Scottish Government is on pause ahead of next year's referendum, but what specific action she wanted of either Scottish or UK ministers was, I think, rather unclear. That's not to diminish the seriousness of the challenges facing those we represent. Increased food, childcare and energy costs all play their part, and no one can be anything other than appalled at the high levels of fuel poverty or growing numbers of our citizens presenting at food banks. These are issues that demand an urgent response from both Scotland's governments. In my opening remarks, I set out some of the important steps being taken at a UK level. A fundamental shift in the tax system, for example, that will see 240,000 low-paid Scots taken out of paying any income tax at all. This is a lasting, progressive and fair reform of our tax system. On pensions too, I set out the effect of the so-called triple lock, which will ensure that the state pension rises in line with inflation, wages, or by 2.5%, whichever is highest, delivering the highest ever cash increase to the state pension in 2012. Again, a lasting, progressive and fair reform of our pensions. And on childcare and fuel costs, the coalition government has also taken action to help hard-pressed families and individuals. Already in England, 20% of 2-year-olds from the poorest backgrounds are receiving free nursery provision. This will rise to 40% by next year. And from 2015, UK Government will meet 20% of childcare costs for working families, building up to £1,200 per child under the age of 12 per year, a scheme worth £750 million. Meanwhile, in the face of rising fuel costs, the UK Government has confirmed a further freeze in the duty for the next 2 years. The Warm Homes discount, worth over £1 billion, is also providing support to manage fuel bills, over and above the steps being taken forward through the Green Deal and ECHO. Not surprisingly, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think most, if not all, members chose to focus much of their remarks on the impact of welfare reform, and I can certainly understand that. Indeed, it is something I probably should have addressed in more detail in my own opening remarks. But from listening to the debate today, one would assume that neither the SNP nor Labour accept the need for welfare reform, but that simply isn't true. We know that the previous Labour government was preparing proposals very similar to those now being taken forward by the coalition, and Ed Balls last December promised, quote, a tougher approach to conditionality for benefit claimants. Meanwhile, Nicola Sturgeon has talked previously about the need to, quote, simplify welfare, though without sharing with us the details of what this entailed. The lack of detail may be convenient for the SNP ahead of next September, but it does leave them having to explain what, if any, reduction in the £2.5 billion welfare bill they would expect to achieve. I did so in the first time, not this time, Mark. Indeed, John Wilson, John Mason, Kenny Gibson and other SNP backbenchers seemed intent this afternoon on hiking those costs still further. Given that the Nationalists' own Fiscal Commission has conceded today, albeit hidden in the footnotes, that an oil fund by 2017-18 would require £3.4 billion to be taken out of public spending, it is even more unclear how the SNP propose to pay for their promises on welfare. Unlike Patrick Harvey, all appear to want Scandinavian levels of spending without committing to Scandinavian levels of taxation. Deputy Presiding Officer, I entirely accept that implementing reforms to our welfare system has been hugely difficult for many of those directly affected. I know this from my own casework, where changes need to be made to mitigate the impacts. This has been done and absolutely must continue to be done. But denying the need for reform or insisting this can somehow be achieved without controversy is disingenuous. The notion, as Nicola Sturgeon implies, that you can simplify without creating winners or losers is simply ridiculous. The reality is the current system too often provides the wrong incentives. For too many people, it acts as a real obstacle to work. As much as anything else, this is unfair to claimants themselves. Over a period when our economy experienced almost uninterrupted growth, the welfare budget ballooned by over 40% in real terms. So a strategy for job creation is essential, but is not the whole answer. In the UK, we have 5 million people trapped on out-of-work benefits, one of the highest rates of worklessness households in Europe, and almost 2 million children living in homes where no one has a job. For Scotland, the picture is no less grim. I agree with Kenny Gibson. Tinkering around at the edges won't cut it. But promising to maintain or even increase current levels of spend on welfare is neither honest nor affordable. Trapping people on benefits rather than providing incentives and support into work is also not desirable. It is right we continue to press for appropriate changes and safeguards beyond those already given, but claiming to be in favour of reform, but holding the view that any cuts to any benefits or any tinkering of any demands placed on recipients is automatically unfair is just not credible. Deputy Presiding Officer, let me conclude by making a more parochial point. Nowhere is the cost of living higher than in the islands. Fuel, food, travel are all more expensive than on the mainland. Childcare too, where it is available. Thanks to the Liberal Democrats, fuel duty in all our islands has been cut by 5p. Fuel is still more expensive than on the mainland, but the price differential is less. By contrast, the SNP government has chosen to cut Air Discount Scheme, increasing costs to business in our island communities, and exclude Orkney and Shetland from a cheap ferry fare scheme focused solely on the West Coast routes. This lacks fairness or any awareness of the additional costs for those living and working in the islands, such as those I represent. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Alex Johnson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. This has been an interesting debate and one which we managed to, at least for part of the time, turn away from this strange notion that everything would be better in an independent Scotland. Today we've actually discussed something that is important. We've discussed the price of living and we've discussed it in terms of the economy and what has changed within the economy in recent years. But I have to say, we've made that old mistake. We've made that radical assumption that the world began on the 6th of May 2010. The Labour Party have chosen to characterise this debate as if that was year zero, as if nothing happened before the 6th of May 2010. No, I'm sure you'll get the opportunity in a minute. I'd like to go on and tell you about what did happen before the 6th of May 2010, because that was the time when we had a Labour government that demonstrated its level of fiscal responsibility. We had a Labour government and we had a Chancellor who decided to take millions of people into the tax system at the bottom end by introducing the 10% tax band and then doubling that to 20%. We had a Labour government who were determined not to freeze fuel prices, but in terms of road fuel prices, cause them to rocket with a fuel price escalator. We even heard Ken McIntosh complain about the price of fuel and how much it cost him to fill his car. Yet he failed to acknowledge that the current government, through actions it has taken, has made fuel 13 pence a litre cheaper at the pump than it would otherwise have been. And it's not just what it does to our cars. Also remember that in Scotland, our connections are longer, our roads are longer, our communities are further apart. So the cost to business and the cost in terms of transport of goods to supermarkets means that prices are higher in Scotland, and this government has delivered a substantial cut in what it would otherwise have been. But let's look at some of the other things that the Conservatives have done which contrast what the previous Labour government chose to do. All these millions of people who were dragged back into tax on basic incomes have been released from that bondage. The Conservatives, with their Liberal Democrat allies, have taken the opportunity to raise the tax threshold to ensure that there are £700 a year more income for low-income families than there would otherwise have been by the 1st of April next year. That is why, and I can also take the opportunity to remind Patrick Harvie once again that that is paid for from nowhere else other than the reduction in the threshold for higher rate taxpayers. So higher rate taxpayers are paying for the increase in the tax threshold. What else have we done? I'm afraid I have a limited amount of time and I will continue. What else have we done? Well, we also took the opportunity to ensure that there is something I need to get in here before I move on. We've also heard the Labour Party go on at some length today about something which I like to call the under-occupancy charge. There are other people in this room who have a different name for it. But I'd like to ask the Labour Party in particular if they can remember what it was they called it back in 2008 when they invented it. Because there is a mystery surrounding this, because the under-occupancy charge was an invention of the previous Labour government. Back in 2008, they decided to enforce that charge on anyone who was renting in the private sector and who was claiming housing benefit. Now, I cannot understand how it is that they are able to bring forward proposals for legislation which are designed to save all those people who were caught out by this change in the policy of a Conservative government, and not save those people who were originally dragged into that tax loophole by the previous Labour government. There are other things that have been said in this debate today that must be addressed. There is this idea that wages have fallen in Scotland. Of course, we know wages have fallen in Scotland, and in real terms, and we know that that has happened both in the public and in the private sector. But we must also remember that action has been taken in the public sector and in some areas of the private sector to ensure that those on the lowest pay have been protected from that fall. We have taken the opportunity to make sure that when wages were frozen at the height of the crisis, the low-paid were made an exception to that. During the course of this debate, we have heard repeatedly how Labour would do things differently. The truth is that we have plenty of examples of how Labour have chosen to do things in the past. The minute I hear Ed Miliband talk about the idea of fixing the price of fuel, I immediately have a race of word association, because the last time Labour talked of price fixing was back in the 1970s. It then led to wage fixing, it then led to an IMF bailout, and it then led to the winter of discontent.
It's now leading to
we
closure,
have learned the lesson
please.
of the past. We will not repeat that failure. The Labour Party have no memory of the past and are doomed to repeat that failure for the future.
Many thanks. Colleen Alec Neil, Cabinet Secretary, up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. It seems as though it's becoming bitter together rather than better together. Can I say in this debate, there have been one or two good speeches. Kesa Dugdale made a good speech, Mark MacDonald made a good speech, John Wilson made a good speech, but I actually think the key point was made by James Dornan, which is whether we're talking about poverty and deprivation in recent years, or whether we're talking about it over the last decade or the last 20, 30 or 40 years, the fact of life is that irrespective of which government has been in power in London, The union has failed to deliver for the Scottish people, and far too many of our people, generation after generation, have been forced to live in poverty and deprivation. And as James Dornan rightly said, achieving independence is a prerequisite to solving the problems of poverty and deprivation in Scotland. Now, I have to say, since this is... Of course I will. Of course I will.
Malik. Thank you for taking that. James Dorman got some things wrong as well about nursery places and so on. Glasgow City Council actually introduced them before he even got there.
I'm reducing the point because one or two speakers from the Labour benches alleged that childcare in Scotland was the most expensive in the UK. That's not true. If you look at the Daycare Trust report in March 2013, it made it absolutely clear that Scotland has cheaper nursery places and childcare overall compared to south of the border. So at least let us get our facts right about the achievements of the SNP government over the last 6 years. Now, I have to say that I find Labour's position today lacking credibility for 3 reasons. First of all, during their 13 wasted years, they made practically no impact on the measures that we're talking about today. If you look at the facts as opposed to what they allege, let's look at Labour's record during those 13 wasted years. We've had a report out in the last 2 weeks which shows that over the last 40 years, and Labour was in power for 18 of those 40 years, over the last 40 years, there have been 1.5 million more children in the UK living in poverty than there was, not at the moment, than there was 40 years ago. Now, given that Labour was in power for nearly half that period, they have to share some of that responsibility. Secondly, after they had bankrupted Britain, the level of unemployment left by the Labour government was in the millions. Not just the unemployed, but the underemployed and the hidden unemployment as well. And thirdly, when you look at Labour's record, after 13 wasted years, Britain was the 4th most unequal country in the whole of the Western world. Of course I'll take an intervention. Choose between yourselves. Yes.
Could I talk about the SNP's wasted years? Because perhaps the Cabinet Secretary would acknowledge that in the first 8 years of the Parliament, relative child poverty fell by a third, absolute child poverty fell by 2/3. Under your government, it's flatlining. Progress has stalled.
Alec misses the point. And that is, when we get a yes vote next year, it won't be dropping, it will eliminate child poverty in Scotland. What an ambition for a Labour Party that tries to call itself socialist, that it wants to drop child poverty by a few percentage points. We should be talking about the elimination of child poverty in Scotland. And where there's real poverty is the poverty of ambition of the Labour Party in Scotland. They are a disgrace. And, you know, I hate to agree with the Tories, but Alec Johnson was correct. The Labour Party introduced the bedroom tax, presiding officer. And they are the ones who, quite frankly, should be ashamed of themselves, because as with privatisation, as with many other policies, they paved the way for the most right-wing government since Mrs Thatcher. Of course I'll give
Drew Smith. I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary, and on that very point, the point is that the proposal for a bedroom tax on social tenants was presented to the Labour government and explicitly ruled out.
Alec Neil. Well, actually, you should listen to what Caroline Flint, who's your housing spokesman, said at Westminster, because she specifically ruled it in and said that a Labour government would keep the bedroom tax. but they're all over the place. One week they're for it, the next week they're against it. It's like the old music hall song. She wouldn't say yes, she wouldn't say no, she wouldn't say yes, stop, she wouldn't say yes, she wouldn't say go, she wouldn't say stop, and she wouldn't say go. Presiding officer, I'm better at singing it than saying it. So the reality is Labour is all, I will in a minute, Labour is all over the place. You know, I have to say, listening to my friend Malcolm Chisholm, I will in a minute, he's all over the place, totally muddled. Because the logic of Malcolm Chisholm's position is to vote yes next year, because that's how you avoid the kind of policies that Malcolm has fought against all his days. Yes, I'll give way.
Ian Gray.
On the theme of being all over the place, I understood that the SNP were against evictions on the basis of arrears to do with the bedroom tax. That was last week, so this week Jackie Baillie has a bill which would make that happen. Will he sign that this week, or is he in fact all over the place?
I gave way because I thought it was going to be original. Tell you what I'm doing. I'm fighting against Labour-controlled North Lanarkshire Council because they're evicting people as we speak. They're evicting disabled people as we speak. So we won't take the two-faced approach from the Labour Party on evictions for the bedroom tax. Presiding officer, I started by saying they've no credibility. They talk about poverty in one hand and they're planning the Cuts Commission on the other. You can't have both. You either believe in the social wage, in concessionary fares for the elderly and the disabled, for free personal care, for free prescriptions and all the other things this government has introduced, or you believe in the Cuts Commission. And let me finish by saying this. It's a little ironic, presiding officer, that the phraseology used at the Tory conference this week was something for nothing. George Osborne said, not something for nothing culture. Ian Duncan Smith said there's something for nothing culture. And Joanne Lamont said there's something for nothing culture. They speak with a Tory voice in Scotland.
Many thanks. And I now call on Ian Gray to wind up this debate. Mr Gray, you have until 5:09.
5:09. Thank you, Presiding Officer. 2 weeks ago we debated the Scottish economy. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance that day painted a rosy picture of recovery, GDP up over the year, employment up over the year, surveys showing that purchasing managers, the Bank of Scotland and small businesses are more confident than they were. Today's debate is deliberately designed to look beyond those carefully selected headlines of recovery to the hard, sometimes even harsh world of reality. And I have to say that I think generally on all sides of the House that is what people have done, with the exception perhaps of the final contributions from Alec Johnson and Alec Neil, which had a passing relationship, I have to say, with both reality and indeed the truth. Because most Scots would not recognise that recovery that Mr Swinney was at such pains to describe a couple of weeks ago, any more than they would recognise the recovery described by George Osborne this week. And Jackie Baillie made clear our view that the responsibility for the structural weakness in the recovery lies with George Osborne and the coalition government. Because a recovery built on jobs which are increasingly part-time, temporary or zero-hour contracts without job security or even a guarantee of work feels like no recovery at all. A recovery built on declining wages, which no longer stretch to pay the gas and electricity bill or don't look at childcare costs. Welfare changes, which are already leaving 80,000 Scottish households struggling to pay a rent, augmented by the bedroom tax. That is a recovery for the rich, while most face a struggle to survive. And it is not getting better. In fact, it's getting worse, as many speakers on all sides have demonstrated, using sources as diverse as the IFS and as does Mumdex, showing that the real value of wages is falling. The proportion of Scottish families living below the living wage is rising. Zero-hour contracts have soared in Britain, 1 million in Britain, so perhaps 100,000 in Scotland. Energy Action Scotland tell us that 900,000 Scottish households are living in fuel poverty, and 220,000 Scottish children live in absolute poverty, and that figure is not improving. And Kezia Dugdale and Jackie Baillie are right to point out that when we had a Labour government in Westminster and a Labour-led government here, that figure plummeted. That progress has stopped. Twice as many Scots now resorting to food banks, many more resorting to payday loans. And 1 in 3 council tenants affected by the bedroom tax are already in arrears. This is not recovery. It is a reversal of living standards, and it demands urgent action now. And in response, the SNP amendment, and most of their speakers have gloriously missed the point. The fact is, if you are struggling in a minimum wage job on 0 hours in a property deemed too big for you, then you don't pay council tax. Chances are your children won't go to university, given this government's woeful record on widening access. You can't, you can't afford a car. You can't afford a car to cross the Forth Bridge for free. And if you can still find a bus service running, then the fare you pay will have been pushed up by the cut in the concessionary travel recompense to the bus companies. So although when you're 60 it will be free, right now you can't afford it. The truth is, for people in those circumstances, they worry about getting through to the end of the week, not until they're 65 and they get free personal care. I'm sorry, my time's been cut. And as for extended childcare, Kezia Dugdale has made clear we've waited 7 years on that promise, and it still falls short of what is proposed everywhere else in the country. Now, whatever the merit or otherwise of these policies, and we introduced several of them and supported others, they do not add up to a strategy to raise living standards or to eradicate poverty. Quite the reverse. Annabel Ewing said her government was straining every sinew to help hard-pressed families. So why then do they refuse to find the full £50 million this year and next year to banish the effects of the bedroom tax from Scotland? John Wilson made an eloquent case that the national minimum... John Wilson made an eloquent case that the national minimum wage is not enough. So why then does the government he supports refuse to use their own procurement contracts to demand that companies pay the living wage? You know, whatever else they might be guilty of, last week Scotland's biggest company, SSE, announced that it would become a living wage employer. Not just direct employees, but the whole supply chain of subcontractors too. If they can do that, why can't the Scottish Government follow their example? And why does the Scottish Government refuse to use those same contracts to outlaw exploitative zero-hour jobs? We agree that a contract like the Borders Railway should boost jobs in the economy, but it shouldn't give succour to firms who leave workers sitting at home on 0 hours contracts. And how can it be that those universities, recipients of all that taxpayer funding for tuition fees, can be the worst offenders when it comes to 0 hours contracts and the government just shrugs its shoulders? These are all things that this government could do but chooses not to. Because the core argument of the SNP is, if you want us to help and support you, first you have to vote for separation. And if they get independence, what is it they promise to do? Will they match Labour's energy price freeze commitment and introduce a regulator to control them in future? Will they? No. I'll tell you what they'll do. They will give those energy companies a huge corporation tax windfall instead, paid for by service cuts and taxes by the same people who are paying through the nose for their bills. And will the SNP match Labour's promise to end exploitative zero-hours contracts? No. An independent Scotland's going to be a zero-hour haven as well as a tax haven. And will the SNP, will they match Labour's commitment on nurseries for 3- and 4-year-olds and wrap-around childcare for all primary pupils? You don't even need a yes vote for that. You could do it right now. No.
Order.
Angela Constance.
Order.
I know most people weren't here when she spoke, but Angela Constance said, and I think she was sincere, that she was determined to tackle the root causes of poverty. Well, when it comes to what really matters to a government, the best way to find out is to follow the money. So let's look at poverty. Back in 2007, the SNP had £1.5 billion worth of programmes, easily identifiable, clearly designed to address poverty. Funds like Community Regeneration Fund, Fairer Scotland Fund, Supporting People Fund. It added up to £1.5 billion. Now, 6 years on, how is that going? In this year's budget, what have we got? Community Regeneration Fund, £132 million. Now, nothing. Anti-Social Behaviour Fund, £37 million. Now, nothing. Fairer Scotland Fund. How many on these benches said they wanted a fairer Scotland? £163 million in 2007. How much now? Nothing. Zero. Zilch. I know what Mr Mackay is going to say. He's going to say... He wasn't here.
Order.
He wasn't here. He's going to say it's all been rolled into the local authorities' money, isn't it? Because here's the truth. These poverty programmes are how this government paid for the council tax freeze and getting rid of the bus tolls, the tolls on the Forth Bridge. Kenny Gibson said we had to understand that they had 10% less resource to fight poverty. No, Kenny, you've got 75% less resource that the government you support have cut out of poverty programmes in their last 6 years.
Mr Gray, you need to wind up.
Is that because poverty's gone? No, I'm finished now. I'm over time.
The member's in his last few seconds.
Is that because poverty has gone? No. Is it because Scotland is already a paragon of fairness? No. These programmes have gone because this is the cost of living in a country with a government which puts party first and the people of Scotland second. This is the price of a Scotland on pause.
That concludes the debate on the cost of living. Ms Dugdale.
In response to a question by Annabel Ewing, the Education Secretary correctly said that he could not comment on the closure of schools in Fife, as he may be asked to rule on them should they be called in at some later point. He said it is inappropriate to comment further at this stage on Fife Council's plans in case that is seen to prejudice any decisions that must be taken. Against that backdrop, Presiding Officer, perhaps the Education Secretary could explain this picture, tweeted by Peter Morrell, Chief Executive of the SNP, which has the Education Secretary proudly posing with SNP literature entitled Save Our Schools. Does the Presiding Officer...
Order! Order! Order, Ms Dugdale.
Does the Presiding Officer believe the Education Secretary has compromised his position with his conduct in the Dunfermline by-election?
Ms Dugdale, that was a debating point. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 7875 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion 7875.
Moved.
No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 7875 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 7876 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out an extension to the Stage 1 timetable for the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. I'd ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 7876.
Moved.
No members asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 7876 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion. I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 7877 on approval of an SSI.
Formally moved.
I'd ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, and I call on Alex Johnson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Last Wednesday morning, the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee took evidence and subsequently voted on the Rosyth International Container Terminal Harbour Revision Order 2013. At that meeting, we had the opportunity to question Minister and officials. A number of questions were raised, including issues regarding the multimodal provision for access to such a terminal and whether ultimately it would only be roads that were used for that purpose. There was also questions regarding the capacity and whether projections made at the decisions surrounding the NPF2 paper some years before were accurate and appropriate. Indeed, I will give way.
Thank the member for giving way. The government had initially included mitigation measures in clause 17.6, but I'm puzzled and disconcerted that this has been removed with only a promise from the Minister. However good he is, he could be replaced tomorrow and those assurances could be dispensed with. Those mitigation measures, I hope the member would agree, should be included in the order. My other concern is that the process has been salami-sliced, with the marine licensing process considering major parts of the environmental impact, including dredging of the Forth in a special protection area. Would the member consider these as important factors and that they should therefore be rejected as a consideration?
I do consider these to be important factors, and I believe that they should have been taken appropriately into account. It has to be said that mitigation of the environmental impacts, as well as other noise and other concerns. Yes.
To remind the member he's only got 3 minutes.
Indeed. Willie Rennie, the member actually raised the issue of roads being the only way to access this proposed facility, but the RSPB have actually said that if this is approved by the affirmative procedure at this point, approval could actually be in breach of EU law. And RSPB Scotland believe that the order shouldn't be made until an environmental assessment has been completed and the results taken into account. Is that a view the member shares?
You've got under a minute.
I certainly acknowledge the member's concern. In drawing to a conclusion, I have to say that members around this chamber have expressed significant concerns about the clarity of the answers given to some of these issues. And while there will only be a minority of us prepared to vote against it tonight, I do believe that these concerns are well founded. At the meeting last Wednesday, the result of the vote was 4-3. It will not be so close in this case, but I think we have a duty to make sure that we take the appropriate action at this time.
I now call on Keith Brown to respond, Minister.
Can I thank you, Presiding Officer, for the chance to speak on this order, which I believe offers benefits for Scotland and for the local area by providing for the development of modern port facilities and will provide jobs both in construction, estimated to be around 500 jobs, and in operation and a contribution to our economy. The project... I will do.
I thank the Minister for taking intervention. Could I seek assurances today from the Minister that if this harbour revision order is passed, that the range of community environmental concerns and the concern that the EIA has not yet been completed will be monitored and acted on if necessary?
Minister.
I'll go on to mention that there are two further processes which should ensure or give the reassurances that the member seeks. First of all is the CEMP, the construction plan, and also the fact that the marine licence is still to be approved and no work can take place either on the river or on shore until that marine licence is approved. The project was included in the second National Planning Framework, NPF2, and I remain of the view that the proposal meets the criteria outlined at that time. The site does have rail infrastructure which can be brought into use if the demand is forthcoming. I also recognise, of course, that there has been an ongoing local objection to the proposal. However, this objection and many others were considered at a lengthy public local inquiry. In proposing to make the order, I have taken into account the majority of the recommendations from that inquiry and some additional changes following the further period of consultation. These changes include mitigation measures and safeguards, including a requirement that the works can't commence until the Construction Environmental Management Plan, which I have mentioned, is refined and approved by Scottish ministers, following further consultation with local communities and environmental bodies. And I can assure Parliament that this will not be diluted from the draft considered by the reporters. I would also acknowledge the further assessment of the impacts of the proposed dredging is required, and I consider, in line with the reporters' recommendations and in keeping with the Habitats regulations, that this can best be carried out using the expertise of Marine Scotland in considering an application for a marine licence, without which, as I have said, the project cannot proceed. I believe the project will strengthen our commitment to a diverse and market-led ports industry and provide our manufacturers and importers with choice in moving their goods to markets, and I would commend this order to members.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of a further Parliamentary Bureau motion. I ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 7878 on stage 2 of the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill.
Moved.
Question on this motion will be put at decision time. There are 6 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 7872.3 in the name of Alex Neil, which seeks to amend motion number 7872 in the name of Jackie Bailey on the cost of living be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7872.3 in the name of Alex Neil is as follows. Yes, 65. No, 49. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 7872.4 in the name of Gavin Brown, which seeks to amend motion number 7872 in the name of Jackie Bailey on the cost of living be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. We move to vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7872.4 in the name of Gavin Brown is as follows. Yes, 19. No, 95. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 7872.1 in the name of Liam MacArthur, which seeks to amend motion number 7872 in the name of Jackie Bailey on the cost of living be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7872.1 in the name of Liam MacArthur is as follows. Yes, 19. No, 95. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7872 in the name of Jackie Bailey as amended on the cost of living be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 7872 in the name of Jackie Bailey as amended is as follows. Yes, 65, no, 49. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7877 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 7877 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick is as follows. Yes, 88, no, 24. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7878 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.